And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, you know, we built this city on rock and roll.
Yes, we did.
After all. But apparently the Constitution doesn't matter anymore because now we have presidents who target their political opponents and threaten to put them in jail.
Don't you mean wannabe dictators?
This is an interesting situation going on here, and we're going to get into it tonight because it's a crucial piece of what's going on in the background with Stepford Biden and the media, especially lapdog Rachel Maddow, running these little deals out there saying, Trump, if you withdraw from the race, we might pardon you and prevent you from going to prison from this phony classified info charge, which, if you're guilty, so is every other president on planet Earth right now, including Jimmy Carter. So we've got something kind of challenging there as a whole to look into and see what's the nature of the deal that they're attempting to do. Because obviously Trump in the most recent poll is 12 points up on Biden. And he is 40 points up on his nearest Republican challenger. So they're afraid that one way or another, even with all the negative press, they're not going to beat this guy because of the horrible antics of the administration in power now. So it becomes very important for us looking at this situation to help figure out how to get rid of the Biden administration and hopefully replace it with either the Bobby Kennedy administration or return of the Trump administration. And if there were other options in the field, we could look at them too, but those are the only ones, unless you want to talk about Chris Christie and other people like that who are just basically Bush wannabes. Tonight we have a special episode for you. It's JFK Cog UFO. This is campaign 2024, government secrets revealed. And it's a very interesting report because we're going to show you instances of the activity of the continuity of government COG program. Now, we've brought up COG on this program, but their activities have become particularly sort of present in the current mix of UFO threat land. And I'm going to show you how decades of personnel changes have led this to be one of the most powerful organizations on the planet. And they're moving very quickly now at this pace here before the 2024 election can kick in to get some kind of continuity of government program action happening. Because after all, the emergency powers give them all the power that they need. And the UFO threat is the way to get it. I've been pointing out since the beginning of this year in terms of the campaign that whoever was on top of the UFO real disclosure was going to really be a major player for 2024. And this is panning out because it's just, it's something that they need to roll out on a timeline, and they're using it as part of their method for 2024, the powers that be, the deep state, working in the background around this. So the campaigns like the Trump campaign, like the Bobby Kennedy campaign, are starting to come on board and breathe out interest in the topic. And we know that both in their families go deep, deep into the UFO file. Trump through Uncle John and Vannevar Bush, and of course, Bobby through his uncle Jack, who we're going to find out is very deep in the UFO file. We've laid out some of that, but I'm going to try to put these things together in terms of what we're looking at and what we're in the midst of with this vast false PSYOP CIA disclosure that's going on around the UFO file, and how the CIA is engaged in earnest in trying to hijack the entire conversation and debate and everything. And all of the UFO researchers are hanging around like, shucks, those intelligence agencies are the greatest and they just want to give everyone disclosure. What's the problem? So I'm not buying it, of course, but I can show you where the flaw in that logic is, and the actual end game of the plan that's going on back there in intelligence circles, trying to promote the UFO threat and leave us all in a situation of perpetual panic and fear in relation to this. Now, these UFO hearings that are coming up are interesting. I'm going to read some things about them tonight. But one of the things I want to say about Tim Burchett, who is the Tennessee congressman who has evinced some kind of interest in this, and he's apparently going to lead in questioning the whistleblower, quote unquote. This guy's not a whistleblower. It's very interesting because we had Daniel Ellsberg pass away today, who put out the Pentagon Papers. And, what happens when you put out papers like that? Well, you're going to prison, right? And Grush is, he's another one of these Elizondo fixtures. It's a concoction, and it's a decoy set up there for the real thing. And Elizondo, of course, groomed him and put him in the spotlight. We know that. So, we have more rounds of this CIA disclosure hit going on. And the kind of course I've laid out here on the X series is to go along the route of exploring the real UFO file investigation, because there are real UFOs. And the subject is fascinating and deep, but to avoid the CIA circus. Does it bother anyone that the CIA has taken over, all the debate? They drive the entire conversation. And basically, at this point, there's no one there to stop them that I can see out there. And I've been looking, of course, I'm deep into stopping them on this. And, when it comes to other researchers, we'll take any help I can get. Thank God there's so many of you there in the ideas room, and we can stand on this together. But it is very important to note how quickly the entire field collapses under the weight of a serious stress test. And we also saw some of that with the COVID op, and we saw how quickly people became fascists, and wanted to rat out their neighbor for not wearing a mask and things of this nature. These people who are manipulating the situation behind the scenes are very aware of these types of things going on in humanity, and they've studied our psychology for a long time, and they want to utilize that psychological testing. Tonight's episode on continuity of government brings in the JFK assassination because it is, in fact, an active COG in the X-Protect group. And I'm going to show how the X-Protect people relate directly to the continuity of government people, because they both exist in that twilight where there is no paper trail for any of the work that they do. COG used to be, in fact, much more secret. And this is the interesting thing about it. And I'm going to get into that tonight as well. What they've been doing since 2020 and COVID is they've been parading around COG to try to get it into people's minds as something that is basically inevitable. And of course, COG, continuity of government, if it is enacted, America is under martial law with Northcom at the helm. We're literally that close to that happening. That's the interesting thing about all the kind of events from this year. And during COVID, of course, they raised the possibility, not once, not twice, but more like 12 different occasions. So we're going to get into that tonight. And in the second half of this report, we'll go about 2 hours for tonight's report. In the second half, we'll take your questions. And Miss Olivia is putting those together as we speak. I'm very anxious to get to them as well. Before we go any further, how's the temperature out there?
Good. Caritas Taro said, could DJ give us his take on the claims of Greer's whistleblowers regarding criminal U.S. government actions taken against soldiers as per his press conference?
Yeah, well, that is part of the, in the Q&A, I'm going to get into some of the Greer stuff. I do have some of that. The general buzz from the Greer sort of event, the press event, was that, it ain't like it used to be. And that it was kind of haphazard and not so well put together. But a few interesting people were there in the midst of it. Now, the original disclosure project that was put together by Greer goes back 20 years, and we got some very important people out of that. So I think Greer did good work in that whole milieu of pulling out these people who'd been part of this deep organization and had come forward. And a lot of those people he got on the record over the course of a couple of decades. So, that's very valuable. I think some of the things that were coming out in Greer's event, kind of stretched credulity and credibility. And for me, I would say that we could probably do better in the grand scheme of things. But I'm all up, and I try to salute as many people as possible. We're trying to get to the bottom of the UFO situation, and certainly one thing which I think Greer is on the same side on is that the CIA UFO threat disclosure piece with Elizondo and TTSA and Chris Mellon and that whole circus is dangerous. So in that sense, there's not a whole lot of daylight between our two positions on that at all. What else you got?
A bunch of chatters are asking if Greer is funded by Rockefeller money.
Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. And I think people do get offers for these things over the years. But there was a point, and I think what this relates to is that Lawrence Rockefeller, who, by the way, went to the White House to meet JFK, that's how far back this guy goes, and he's not with us anymore, but he was the Rockefeller who was supposed to be, uh, basically of the opinion that the family had gone too far and he wanted to release some of these secrets. And the UFO file was related to that. So he talked to a number of people, and he held, different roundtables trying to get people involved. And some of those people, like Mac and others, he wanted to give them a boost. There's an interesting meeting that he has where the Clintons go to meet him, and they show Hillary in about 1996 walking around with an E.T. are here book kind of thing. And but that Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller, didn't represent the whole David Rockefeller, that whole thing. He was of a different type, and I think he was basically ostracized by the rest of the family. But I understand, just based on the name alone, how that would come up. And this is interesting. I mean, names are tricky because when you think about what's going on right now with Chris Mellon and the Mellon banking family, Chris Mellon is the DOD official basically running so much of this UFO threat. But we have his cousin who also comes from the Mellon family, but he's the son of John Warner, the late senator from Virginia. And he's called out the whole thing dramatically on this program and in other places. And actually, he spoke at the Greer event. And what he has to say is very important. And it also, it unravels this myth that the Mellon team is after any kind of legit disclosure. They're part of a UFO threat program run by the Central Intelligence Agency. So, we have to be careful when we get around different types of family names to figure out who's who, I think, in relation to that, because there are people in that structure who do want to bring things out. And that's what we want to do, across the board. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Great questions so far. Got so much to get into tonight, and the continuity of government program brings us right into the incidents of 1963 and the removal of President Kennedy, and how 2024 is going to be the most important election of your lifetime and also of the century. There's no question in my mind. So many things at stake in terms of freedom and the need to remove and extract democracy from the Biden machine. Just get that force out of there, because it's being run by committee. Joe was stumbling around today saying, "God save the Queen" to nobody in particular over here in Connecticut. And then he didn't know where to go again, because he's right there having Alzheimer's. And, it's just supposed to be this great unspoken truth. Everyone knows it. And it makes us look like idiots on the world stage. But the more dangerous thing is, what have they got working in the background?
Mm-hmm.
Some clue came up this week, though, which was that Gavin Newsom, Gruesome Newsom, from the governor of California, and I only say that because he threatened martial law during the whole lockdown situation, said, "I can call martial law if I want to." But they did, in fact, make a number of different very, very draconian measures during the lockdowns, and California was the poster child for that fascist activity, and he was the governor. As a matter of fact, it became so unpopular with his constituents that he was recalled. They ran a recall election, and they didn't quite get rid of him, but that was the level of appreciation that they had going on there. The fact that he's on Fox News is somebody's plan to signal we're ready to move past Biden, and it looks like he can't make it a year and a half into this. So there's a year and a half basically to the election, or less. There's actually a year and 4 months. And things come quickly in terms of elections. And the big plan on the Biden side is just, hey, put Trump in jail. But that's not enough of a plan, especially how blatant it looks and how it's never been tried before. We've never had a situation like that. There's a couple of articles, and I want to show where the media is going with this too. And then we're going to get into how the continuity of government players play into this entire theme of emergency powers and basically how we're rolling really fast downhill in relation to this. Okay. Associated Press, anti-vaccine activist Robert Kennedy Jr. challenging Biden in 2020 bid. Now, this is how they always have to preface things with Bobby because, he has to be the fringe kook, anti-vaccine activist. He can't be just, hey, scion of the Kennedy family decides to run, incredible environmental lawyer throws his hat in and gets over 20% of the vote already. That should be the real headline. Bobby has a lot of challenges going on, but what's interesting is his poll numbers are rising dramatically. His favorability is rising the more that people see him and not just hear weird stories about him. This is important, and I think his election, his challenge to the Biden administration and how the DNC has just stacked the deck against him is going to be important looking forward, because we can unravel the entire system based on the level of corruption coming out of the Biden administration. This is very important because we can get election integrity back by exposing some of the tricks that they're trying to pull. And the guy sitting right in the middle of all that is RFK Jr. What's interesting is there's been an interesting trend that I've been watching, Daily Cost, for example, and these other liberal, really horrible websites. I mean, you really can almost get nothing out of them. This is the horrible thing. It's the content level of the ideas and the debate isn't there because they're all in a weird echo chamber, loving themselves and their weird points of view about, drag shows for kids and things of this nature. So Daily Cost, now their new thing is to play the victim. It's that Bobby is the big bad guy, and we're getting sued by wealthy anti-vaxxer and now presidential Kate. This suit is getting expensive. They're going to their readers trying to get money to fight Bobby Kennedy because they said so many wrong things about him, and in a court of law, they're going down for this. And, they were misquoting him and they were going to all lengths to disparage his candidacy. And he called them out on it. He said, I'm taking you to court, which people should do more often. Daily Cost would be nowhere without our community. That's why we strongly believe it's essential that Daily Cost take all effort to protect the anonymity of all its users, protecting them from adverse treatment, like in the workplace, or even physical harm. Daily Cost has been fighting a lawsuit filed by prominent anti-vaxxer Robert Kennedy to unmask a user who wrote a story critical of Kennedy's attendance at a rally in Berlin that was organized, promoted, and attended by neo-Nazis. This is completely false story. And Kennedy did go to Berlin, and it was also the site where JFK gave his great speech. Ich bin ein Berliner, as it were. And what's interesting about this too is just how they really have to dig deep to get things on Kennedy. It's like it's not going to be easy to go after this guy. So the anonymous source that they were using, they were like, "Oh, Kennedy knew it was a Nazi and he was there." And Kennedy's like, "No, that's BS. And you're going to have to give me the source of who the story is." And they're like, "Oh, we're protecting our user," because they don't exist. It should be noted that Kennedy is not suing the New York Times, CBS, or other media outlets. He's sicking his lawyers on Daily Cost because we're a smaller independent news. Yeah. Who's running you, though? George Soros and his son. So they have to know that Kennedy means business. He's not going to be somebody that you're going to be able to drag through the mud. He is, after all, a lawyer. And this is a good sign, in my mind, that Bobby's out there swinging. The next person he really needs to swing at is Biden. But I do think that, catch the headline again. It's getting sued by wealthy anti-vaxxer. So the anti-vaxxer thing, they're hanging their whole hat on this. Now, some of the positive developments in the Kennedy campaign is that he got to go on Joe Rogan. And it was very interesting. And, I don't always say I'm a big fan of the Rogan show. This one was a good one. And, sometimes I just think that the show doesn't go to deep levels, and it uses a lot of buzz on top, and I remember I get this question a lot, and people are like, "Well, which UFO show of Joe Rogan's is your favorite?" And I say, "Well, Joe Rogan's never done a UFO show, not a real one." So, when you get on the level of what a UFO show is, if you sit there and talk to Chris Mellon about CIA points about false UFO disclosure, that's not a UFO show. So the people need to know the difference, I think, when these things come up. So that's what I mean by that. No slight against Joe Rogan, because after all, Joe Rogan doing this show with Robert Kennedy, I think, is a big deal. So, and he did a nice job letting Bobby talk about Fauci and some of the deep things that are important to him. They didn't actually go very deep on the presidential campaign because there was so much to lay out there on the COVID op. But I think it was important to put it on the record, and there's lots of time to do things in relation to the rest of his campaign. But I think it was important for people to get that comprehensive study. Look, when you're dealing with RFK Jr., you're dealing with someone who's won lawsuits against Monsanto, and he's fought for environmental causes. He's fought for farmers. This is not somebody you're going to be able to brush off and, pull tricks on. He really is somebody who has a stellar record. And if you're going to take him on the issues. If all you can do is say, anti-vaxxer, anti-vaxxer, that's not a campaign. So you can see already the Biden forces and the media forces behind them, who are largely being fed their talking points by the intelligence agencies. They're not sure how to go after this guy. And that's pretty much the tune that they've stuck to. In my opinion, it's a losing battle on that. And that's why they're going to have to change their tune. And in my opinion, they're going to go much harder. You can expect to see a lot more dirty stuff coming out against Mr. Kennedy. And I think that'll just make them look worse. What's interesting is Kennedy's taken the strategy of going to podcasts and really almost bypassing the media. It's not like you're going to see him on a CNN town hall anytime soon, especially after they got that incredible blowout of Trump going on there and, spinning circles around them. They didn't expect that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is JFK COG UFO Campaign 2024 Government Secrets Revealed. We're going to take your questions in the second half of the program. I am going to lay out, though, in the first half, the continuity of government UFO threat assassination piece, which is crucial for the 2024 election, which I feel is the most important election of our lifetime. I want to remind you, while I have your attention, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter. It's very important that you do that, especially with all the social media censorship we see going on. What do you got there?
Webster McClellan says, "Is RFK Jr. is real? Why is he getting coverage? They are all under control. Root for your favorite fake candidate." A lot of people feel this way. Can you address it?
Well, he's not. He's getting negative attention. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they're shooting him down. Yeah, they could ignore him, but, they don't ignore Trump. They try to shoot Trump down. This is their strategy. They're afraid because of the social media networks that somebody can become big without them. And so therefore, their strategy is to use the muscle that they have to take down a candidate. So no, that's not a sign that if they're talking about him that someone is, some kind of a backdoor candidate.
Yeah, ignoring someone doesn't do much good. Smearing them does a lot of good.
Yeah, well, you can ignore them if you think that their story is going to be stifled, if you think that they can't get their message out. But, Kennedy's a multimillionaire. He has all the name cred. He's got incredible backing. And we're going to find out tonight some very interesting friends along the way. He's the son of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the nephew of President Kennedy and the nephew of Senator Ted Kennedy. And it's interesting because he brings up his dad and his uncle, John, a lot. He doesn't bring up Ted very much because I think that Ted is not really a strong selling point and that he didn't really have the same admiration and adulation. Maybe he thought that Ted went along with the system a little too much. And I would tend to agree with that, in fact. One other thing I want to say about censorship is a lot of you have told me about getting unsubscribed from YouTube, and I get regular messages about this. All I can say is, resubscribe, but if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll always be in the loop. And you're going to want to be on that newsletter list because we have some fascinating shows coming up for you, X series shows, amazing interviews next week. And for June and July, just stellar things, and also an event coming up this summer that you want to be in the know for, along with other events in the fall and documentaries, all sorts of wildness, including some truly, truly amazing guests. So make sure that you're on that newsletter list, and it's a free newsletter. Like I said, take the minute to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that. Okay, Miss Olivia, if you have anything
No,
else?
I'm good for right now.
Okay, good. Let's go. Let's go and see how the crisscross between 1963 and 2024 is. Now, there was a speech given in June of 1963 by President Kennedy at American University, and he said he got past the State Department with the speech, and he said that we need to sort of coexist with the Russians, and we can never risk having a nuclear war where even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. Now, humanizing the other side was a dramatic thing, and many people, including Professor Scott, who spent 5 decades on this, feel that this was one of the major dominoes where they decided that they were going to remove Kennedy. And through that, he got the nuclear test ban treaty, because the Russians were like, well, this guy, he is looking out for the future, and we're going to join him in that. We won't do atmosphere tests. That's gigantic that they stopped doing that, because we had brought the world to the precipice of nuclear war, as the Biden administration is doing to us right now with its reckless Ukraine-Russia war, which could be solved by a peace process. But there is no peace process because they want perpetual war, because the neocons are in charge of the Biden administration. And the figures that he has there, like Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Lloyd Austin, they're just sitting there talking war strategies and how to degrade Russian forces and remove Vladimir Putin. You'll never get peace like that, and the Ukrainians are losing badly, incidentally. And the estimates are between 300 and 400,000 losses on their side, if you can imagine, all basically over nothing. So, America usually takes the lead with a peace process. There just isn't one here. So the things that they want to move forward require war. And I guess that's going to make all the Lockheed Martin and Boeing CEOs feel good. But basically, they're raising that nation to the ground. Now, Kennedy was getting at this because he saw the futility of the war situation. On the anniversary here, coming into it now on June 20th, RFK Jr. is giving a speech in New Hampshire dealing with foreign policy, where he's going to address the Ukraine war and the situation there. And we can see this crisscross. It's almost a destiny view from 63 to 2024, that you need, in fact, to stand up for peace, and you need to stand up against the aggression of these forces that are turning America into a banana republic. And standing up can be done through an electoral process, through a lawful process, through a protest process. And, very often the provocateurs who suggest that it can be done otherwise and things of that nature are actually sent in to discredit movements that are calling out the government. But this is something that gets very deep, and it gets to, way beyond political parties. So we need to be aware of that. But Kennedy had to deal with it. So let's reflect on what he was going for in this period and how it got him killed, but also saved the world. So this is an interesting balance that we need to look at. Kennedy coming into the White House with incredible high hopes. He gets in despite the fact that the deep state is 100% solid behind Nixon. And he gets in because of his incredible ability to connect with people, his dad's incredible savvy and connections, and the fact that RFK was running his campaign, and RFK was an unbelievable campaign manager and really knew how to get things done. That's going to be crucial for RFK as well. And for Trump, I want to say that, it looks like his team could use it. Even though he's doing well in the polls, his team could use a real aggressive message of, here's the top 10 bullet points of how I'm going to bring America back. They're going to need a program and a message. But Kennedy won the presidency, and he took us in a different direction. He took us towards freedom. He took us towards peace. He initiated tax cuts, and he seemed to upset people on all sides in the sense, but the general thrust was freedom. And he was willing to stand up in extraordinary situations, even, for example, when the Russians placed missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and that they were nuclear missiles, and that he was able to resolve that and save the world from a nuclear exchange and disaster, is something that shows that he was a true statesman, and that so many of the revisionist history pieces of him is just some kind of a lightweight playboy, really don't hold up. This is someone who was incredibly well read, had an incredibly deep experience, and also knew very deeply about secret programs inside the government, including the UFO file. And we're going to get into that as well. His opposition deep inside came from the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was shocked beyond belief the powers that the CIA had at that point in history, coming into office as the president, that they were doing all these programs on their own, had their own Air Force, and had their own mandates for things. And his attempt during those 1,000 days of office was to bring some of that back under presidential control. And it is the struggle throughout his administration to rein in the CIA. And it's interesting that there are factors in the CIA which aren't obvious. So when you read a traditional history, you might hear something about tension with the CIA, but they make it just sound like, oh, it was some Cold War thing, and they thought Kennedy was a peacenik, and, they were more hawks, whatever. It's much deeper than that. It was a whole worldview and the vested interests of world power. And they saw Kennedy as coming in as this disruptor, but they also saw, wait a minute, this guy has the charisma to pull off this disruption. One, two, he's all about peace. He's not going to want to sort of carve up the world for the United States. And three, he's got his brother Bobby waiting in the wings. We're looking at a dynasty. Look at Ted Kennedy is a 32-year-old senator or a 30-year-old senator in 1962. So, they were looking at all kinds of problems here that they felt, we're going to need to cut this guy off. Now, in this process, in the background, we have a Canadian diplomat who's hearing weird things. And he will eventually become one of the great scholars of the JFK assassination. And that's Professor Peter Dale Scott, whose dad was the poet laureate of Canada. And now Professor Scott's been on this program a number of times, and I've spoken to him in the background on things for years. But one of the key things that he brought forward was, after studying the American political process, he coined the term deep state. And the term deep state got bastardized somewhat later, but he was the one who came forward with it. And he wrote a book in the 90s called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. This was the summation of his 3 decades of work on it. One of the weird things that happened to him when he was working in these political circles before Kennedy died is he got hints at these different events that it was in the air that Kennedy was going to be taken out. And when it happened, it dawned on him, to put these pieces together. And it took a number of years and some fascinating work. Professor Scott came up with the theme of deep events, and he calls them deep structural events, which has to be noted that they're structural deep events that are made to change policy. And this group from inside of this structure comes out, works on a program, changes the policy, and then retreats, leaving all the debris of the deep event. Now, he cites 5, and there are indications of many more, and including one with Iran. But the ones that stand out for me and go into this lineage of continuity of government programs and the deep state connections are the Kennedy assassination, 9/11, Watergate, and Iran-Contra. Now, all of these different moves, I would also cite the coup d'etat financial coup d'etat in 2008 and the COVID op and the UFO threat op under development. But in terms of talking about Scott's stuff, he cites those 5. And the other one was the October surprise of the Carter administration. Now, what's going on there is there's a group that's not elected, and they're coming in from this deeper power structure. But where is that structure? How do you find it? The links that he found that were tracked back were inside the Continuity of Government Program, or COG. COG fundamentally has the groundwork to create a totally different government structure if this structure is decapitated, and it was originally set up in case of a nuclear war. There are hints of it as far back as 1936, but it doesn't become a full-fledged program until the CIA Act of 1947. Now, at that point, you're post-nuclear exchange, and you're looking at how do you survive if there's a nuclear exchange. For a while there, we were the only ones with the bomb. and but eventually, as we know, everyone got it. So the Eisenhower administration took this into overdrive and built dramatic underground base facilities. Now, those facilities at this point, including according to people who've come out of them over time, are so, have malls, have highways, and have living quarters, have apartments. It's an entire vast underground world, and they're well set up, and they have vast resources that are off the books. And this is because they're part of a program that doesn't have any oversight, and that's the Continuity of Government Program. People have often asked me in relation to space, well, how could you ever get a secret space program? Everything needs to be allocated towards Congress and everything else. You'd hear about it. Well, the reason you get a secret space program is because if you take the COG rules and just flip them from underground into space, you can do exactly the same thing. And this is what we've seen deep inside the government. I wanted to cite a few examples that we got from Professor Scott on this relating to the JFK assassination and the players who were involved even. Because very often the players who show up come directly out of COG. And they've all been kind of well placed in these deep events. For example, people like Secret Service agents around Kennedy, or Nixon's lawyer, John Dean, or Oliver North, and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. They are part of this chain of setting up this secondary government. So this is a covert government operating alongside the overt public government. So let me get a couple of quotes on this before I jump into it. Miss Olivia, you got it.
Wally Tango Foxtrot. So was Project Warp Speed a COG deployment?
Well, there are personnel involved at a deeper level. So Warp Speed is kind of a almost the very surface level, the commercial level, as it were. When you look at the setup for the thing, for example, the event that was held in October before the event 201, before COVID kicked off, and we had Bill Gates there, and Avril Haines, who became the director of national intelligence under Biden. By the way, she's on record saying, "Oh, these ships that we're seeing could be aliens, and they could be a big threat." So she's right in the heart of the let's launch the threat piece. And she's the intelligence agency top cop. So that's where I would go more in relation to that. Here is, I always start at the end with things and move my way back. This is Professor Scott's summation of what COG is. He says, I'll conclude by again quoting James Mann's dictum that the Mount Weather COG leadership constitutes a permanent, though hidden, national security apparatus of the United States. A world in which presidents come and go, but America always keeps on fighting. Sound familiar? When Stepford Biden is long gone and the Ukraine war maybe turns into a nuclear conflict, they'll have moved on, maybe war with Iran by then. He said, I would like readers to contemplate that elements of this enduring leadership. The elements of this enduring leadership. inside of Professor Scott's work, you're going to find something very interesting, which he related to me, and I couldn't believe was true originally. And then, as more and more details came up in his work, I was absolutely convinced of it, and it is, in fact, true, even to this day. And it is the exemption of the CIA from the rule of law. And this is from Professor Scott's book, Dallas 63, The First Deep State Revolt Against the White House. Quote, from other sources, we learn more about the autonomy of the CIA. It was almost by accident that the public learned of a secret agreement in violation of a congressional statute, whereby the CIA was exempted from reporting crimes of which it was aware to the Justice Department. This agreement was so secret that for almost 2 decades, successive attorney generals were unaware of it. My understanding is that the agreement arose from a flap in Thailand, where a CIA officer who was about to report on the local drug traffic was murdered by another from the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, who was working with it. Now, OPC is important for us to remember. A quick background, because this is the actual CIA that we get to deal with. So the CIA was set up by Truman in 47 and got a real boost in 49. But he originally didn't want to do it. He thought it was basically an American Gestapo. But he got talked into it, and he said, well, I'll make it under the headline that they're going around and getting information and feeding it back to the president, where he can read a briefing of all the global things going on in the world. That was his idea before it became this Frankenstein of these people doing all these unlawful things. Now, inside there, just before they got this activated, there was another group they called OPC. And OPC had this kind of flat name, but they were the ones who were running around fixing elections, blowing up trains, and doing all this crazy stuff. And we see here that this congressional statute, one of the CIA people who were part of the regular group of CIA, there's a split there very early on. This is how you get X-Protect. The split is the regular CIA people, and originally that Truman tried to put in there were people that he knew who were from the military. And some of them will become very outspoken about the UFO file, interestingly enough. What happened, though, was that this group, OPC, got the backing of Dulles. And then when Dulles became the CIA director, he took all of the OPC people and boosted them in their positions so that they became what we came to know as the CIA. Now, what's interesting about this setup is the original group were basically, very intelligent people who were doing gathering of information to give back to the government. This other thing, OPC, was wed to a whole process that involves international finance coming out of New York law firms. And Alan Dulles was right in the heart of that as a New York lawyer for S&C. He was the one who founded that version of the CIA. So you have a big clash there. But as a result of that strange incident in Thailand, where the CIA agent gets killed for reporting, for diming on this other guy who's doing drug running, they got it passed that there was no way that if you were observing crimes and you're in the CIA, if you're witnessing crimes, that you can be prosecuted for not reporting that. And that if you are taking part in those crimes as part of your detail in the CIA, you can't be prosecuted for it. So, in fact, it exempted them from any kind of prosecution. That exempted them from the rule of law. This is where part of the problem comes up. Although this agreement was temporarily ended under the Ford administration, this is interesting too, because when you get to 1975, all of these things are exploding about CIA atrocities, and all the things that they've done around the world are coming out. So as a knee-jerk reaction, Ford, who's taking over for Nixon, who's left because the CIA turned against him and they created Watergate. What goes on is that Ford tries to be like, oh, I'm going to clean things up. He has to come up with this image. And so he uses this statute and says, we're going to take that off. Well, it was taken off temporarily. Then a new secret memo of understanding under Reagan lifted the obligation to report the criminal acts of CIA assets who were drug traffickers. I've argued elsewhere that these covert agreements have been significant factors in augmenting the flow of heroin and cocaine into this country. So you have the whole secret drug running aspect wrapped up there in the fact that these people can't be prosecuted for any of it. And now he says, now what does a memo from the Reagan administration would have little relevance to the Kennedy assassination, but it is of extreme relevance that a prior agreement was enforced from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, exempting the CIA from a statutory requirement to report any criminal activity of any of its employees or assets. This agreement, drawn up under Eisenhower, eventually rescinded under Ford, was so secret that Attorney General Robert Kennedy was never informed of it. We can assume, however, that the agreement was known to those in the CIA officers who suppressed an important clue that would have led to the Soviet intercept program and thereby obstructed a proper investigation of President Kennedy's murder. And he goes deep into how they use this rule as a way to block information flowing about the Kennedy assassination. Very early on, the COG people are operating around the Kennedy assassination. Now, I'm just going to use one example, which is Winston Lawson, who was the Secret Service agent that set up the Dallas trip, working with the mayor of Dallas, who was a CIA agent himself. He was the brother of Charles Cabell, who was the deputy under Allen Dulles, who was the CIA director. Now, Mayor Cabell is interesting for a lot of reasons, but he's working hand in glove with Winston Lawson. And Winston Lawson shows up in a very strange light. One of the interesting facts about him is he's worked in this emergency preparedness program. And what he does is he applies the secret White House communications radio in the motorcade, which they hadn't done before. So they're using this secret broadcasting network to communicate there, which they hadn't. And there was no reason, there was no precedent for it. And when he is questioned, even by the Warren Commission, he lies so sufficiently that for a number of years, there have been questions about his testimony and why did he lie and all the rest of it. But so many of the things that he would be saying would end up being provably false. Interestingly enough, his connection of using the emergency, that's him in the background there, of using this emergency network becomes very crucial to all the information that comes out immediately during the assassination, like the description of Oswald. It comes directly out of this secret COG network. Now, what's interesting is that communications network comes up in every deep event that we're dealing with. Around 9/11, it's there. And certainly for the ones to come, it's going to play a major role, which is why we need to get a handle on it and why they call it inside of the Beltway, the Doomsday Network. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is JFK COG UFO Campaign 2024, Government Secrets Revealed, RFK Jr. and Trump. We're going deep tonight on the continuity of government program through the figure of Professor Peter Dale Scott and his great work, of course, The American Deep State, which basically reveals the whole thing. And I feel like if you go through, you want to go through the different levels of his work. So I would recommend The Road to 9/11, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, and Cocaine Politics. I mean, there's a lot of different books that he has there, but I think the sort of crowning achievement of the whole thing is American Deep State. Inside there, you get the best description of what COG is. Now, bringing it all up to date here, you might have noticed that back in February, we had these strange balloons going across America. And it was an extraordinary situation. It had never happened before, not since World War II, when we developed all these defenses against it because the Japanese had sent over poison bomb balloons and things of this nature. So when it happened, there was a strange reaction inside of the Biden administration. And one of the things that they got us all thinking is that they were changing their filters on how they looked at things through NORAD for air defenses, and that now they could see all this other stuff like balloons. Hey, we've been sitting ducks for 80 years, but thank God now we've changed all that. Well, this was an outright lie, but then we have to wonder what that whole charade was about. So immediately after the fact, of course, we got the strange shoot downs in Canada, over Alaska, over Hawaii, of the sightings of these different things. And then they were like, oh, yeah, we shot them down. And don't worry, we'll get you those films of the debris. And then they never got the films of the debris. Those things never happened. Now, in the middle of that whole situation, you didn't have Stepford Biden coming out from behind the presidential podium and saying, we shot this down, we're really knocking these things down because they're a threat to national security and all the rest of it. Instead, you had the NORAD commander. Well, the NORAD commander is the COG commander. He also is the commander of NORTHCOM. So he's a triple threat there, and that's how they've made his position over the years. He's not original in that. His predecessor was also all three. And the general thrust of this is they're running a situation where they control anything that comes into the airspace of America. So when you started to get all these headlines going on in the background of these shoot downs saying that we're shooting down UFOs and showing this stern face of this general standing up against this UFO threat, it's the big tip off that we just moved, the hand clock a little bit closer to midnight on the COG UFO threat piece. Now, what's interesting about this is that he himself has a connection going deep into UFO lore, which is that he comes out of the 509th group. And the 509th group famously is the group that discovered the Roswell wreckage. Of course, as I've said before, he wasn't around for that, but he's part of the lineage of the 509th bomb squad. Now, it's an important point, and Roswell comes up a couple of times tonight because Roswell is interesting because the group that discovered the wreckage were the only atomic bomb group that we had in the world at that time. So Marcel was the intelligence agent at the head of it. And the things that he came out and said later about, the hieroglyphs and how they had him pose with a weather balloon and all this kind of thing, aren't just sort of chatter in the background. This is somebody who knew. And he also knew that we didn't have anything that flew like this. So General Van Herk's connection to Roswell is very important when you get into this. So now let's open up this UFO piece a little bit. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the JFK COG UFO Campaign 2024 episode. And we're going to go deep, revealing some things here for the first time. And we're going to take your questions in part 2 of this report, which will go to about, say, 10:30 tonight. How does that sound?
Sounds good. Can I throw you a question?
Yes, please.
Contiki Man says, did Peter Dale Scott ever connect COG to the Missouri gang, Truman, Hillenkotter, Clifford, and the Cape Girardeau incident in 1941 while Missouri Senator Truman chaired national defense?
Well, there's our friend Hillenkotter. So we're going to get to Hillenkotter in a little bit. I'm not going to jump ahead on that one, but definitely he's in the mix. And he is a fellow Missourian, as it turns out. Okay. A quick point around this for, there's a lot of people in the actual UFO field who are like, everything's great. The government's giving us what we want. There's no problem. It's disclosure, man. Get on board with it. They're flying me in to interview the top CIA person. And you see this incredibly naive thing going on in all, like from the lowest podcaster to guys like Schellenberger. It's an incredible naivete. Schellenberger now thinks that the intelligence people are going to take him to an underground base and show him a flying saucer. It's not going to happen. Schellenberger, baby. This is a big problem. And what's funny is when you get guys like this who are good in general around different, like government obfuscation and things like that, they're all, they trip out when they get to the UFO file. They become incredibly naive and they're fed. The intelligence people feed them the way that, it's like having Lou Elizondo in your ear. You get some of the most full-time liars working on your case. As it were. So let me just repeat this for any of those people who might be listening. The CIA has absolutely zero incentive to give you the truth about the UFO file. Does that does that make sense? They have no desire to let the public in on the secret of the UFO file, of the technology that they've got from it, of the secrets they've learned, of the reversed engineered technology. They're not going to share any of that with you. And they're certainly not going to share it with a journalist. That's for damn sure. That's a big problem. And they've spent years building walls of secrecy to a point where they've destroyed reputations and killed people. So there's no thing on earth that would give them the right motivation to give you the truth for the heck of it. They're not interested in the truth. The entire organization is built on deception. That's what they're good at. That's what they're created for. Why would they give you the truth about the UFO file? So this is the problem, the naivete and the puffing up of people's egos that, hey, we're going to share this big inside thing with you and you alone. Let's listen to someone who worked inside, was the liaison between the Joint Chiefs and the CIA, and understood that the Kennedy assassination was done by the Central Intelligence Agency. Fletcher Prouty. This is what he had to say in 1997 related to how they were going to use the UFO threat. So, and it's important to note that this is somebody who, had worked inside of those programs since World War II. This is the fundamental game of the secret team. They have their power because they control secrecy and secret intelligence, and because they have the ability to take advantage of the most modern communication system in the world, of global transportation systems, of quantities of weapons of all kinds, and when needed, the full support of a worldwide U.S. military supporting base structure. They can use the finest intelligence system in the world, and more importantly, they've been able to operate under the canopy of an assumed ever-present enemy, up to now called communism. It will be interesting to see what enemy develops in the years ahead. It appears that UFOs and aliens are being primed to fulfill that role for the future. To top all of this, there is the fact that the CIA itself has assumed the right to generate and direct secret operations. They don't need to have it signed off on by the president or anybody. They, in fact, have the right in their own minds to generate and direct secret operations. That's Fletcher Prouty's quote from the intro of his own book in 1997, the re-release of The Secret Team. There is a sober intellectual base that understands the UFO threat piece. Thank God, because in the fields that I get into, you have incredibly fluff journalism on the independent side, and of course on the network and mainstream media side. And it is beyond the pale, the idiocy around which people cater to the CIA UFO threat narrative. We need to bring it back to the idea that the CIA is lying, and that they're going to roll out liars, people who are lying to promote a particular thread, because that agency has not been reformed in any sense. And if you want some proof of that, just go look at the fact that one of their most recent things that have come out about them is that they were plotting the assassination of Julian Assange. So this idea that don't worry, the bad CIA is gone. The good CIA is here to give you disclosure. No, it's the same treacherous organization that is the centerpiece of the deep state that, when you are looking at government corruption, they're the crown. They're the top jewel in the crown. All right. Let's get into some weird now spins going on around this media. This is Wired magazine. UFO whistleblower meet a conspiracy-loving Congress. This is one of those dancing little articles where they're saying all this stuff like, oh, I bet those right-wing Republicans are going to love this UFO stuff. And then in the middle of it, they're like, but that whistleblower talked about all of these alien pilots that he heard about. I wonder if that's true. I mean, could it be? And then they'll be like, oh, those crazy Republicans will lap this up. And then they'll stop in the middle of it again and be like, well, we have had UFOs around for a long time. Maybe it's true. So that's the Wired magazine approach. And it's interesting because when we get into this, we start to see the different trial balloons going on in the media about just how much we will take. So on one hand, you have the whole thing that they've been promoting with the UFO threat piece, which is, oh, there's this stuff going around. It's faster than anything, and it's a threat to us. These Navy pilots just saw it in 2017. And of course, this stuff has been going on for 80 years. I'm going to actually show you a newspaper article from the New York Times in 1960 that reads almost exactly word for word with the situation that's going on with Grush, the whistleblower, right now. Okay, military whistleblower goes public with claims U.S. has secret UFO retrieval program. This is the thing that got the big buzz going last week. The things that we've been able to say about Grush is that, one, all of the things that he's put out there, he said, are things that people have told him or that he's heard about, and he didn't experience any of it. So he's never seen an alien, he's never seen a ship, none of that. That's him posing with his medals, because, you know, those are the types of images that people are going to want to see of him. What we've been hearing with him is that they have these deals in process at the History Channel of putting him together. There's a very interesting series of comments about Grush. One of them, of course, came out from Brian Bender, who was deep in the TTSA op and has since moved away from the UFO threat stuff. And he came out and said, oh, this guy's been groomed, you know, by Lou Elizondo. As a matter of fact, he's been groomed by Elizondo over a year ago. So Elizondo was the chief spokesman for the TTSA thing, broke out on his own. Chris Mellon went behind him. We did a number of shows about that, busted his whole story about leading ATIP and all this stuff. And then later he admitted in his complaint to the Inspector General that ATIP wasn't a program that was funded by the government. It was an activity of his. So, and there were a number of people on board with that. The New York Post was on board with it. The Black Vault was on board with it. So if this guy is being groomed by Lou is taking the mistakes that he's made and he's telling this guy, hey, here's how you can get around that. And this will be perfect timing with my book coming out next year. So we need to kind of get clear on that. The general public who don't know the logistics of these players, they're just going to see a headline and believe it or not, right? But the media is getting on the side of this headline and they're being like, well, he's well decorated, you know. But what's really true is this guy retired at 36, and he was in the NRO, which is like the most super secret. We didn't even know the NRO existed for 3 decades. So the level of secrecy there, CIA influence and the intelligence, just the whole intelligence round that he comes from, you know, would tend to make you think, well, I should be highly skeptical of this person. And even if you were taking him in for congressional questioning, you would have to go in with the understanding that he may be part of an intelligence operation. This is the danger for Congress going in, and for Burchett, for example, thinking, I'm going to get the truth from this guy. I'm just going to sit here and let him go off, you know, saying that he's heard about all this stuff without showing any evidence for anything. So this is the nature of the UFO threat and the way the CIA is doing it. Remember, their whole thing is plausible deniability. They'll go over a cliff, but at the end of the day, at the edge of that cliff, they have a get out of jail free card, which is, I never put anything on the record. You know, I said it was somebody else's testimony. I get out, you know, and that's the key with how they're running and why we can see that the Grush thing is an op. Now, it is an op that goes further in some ways than the Elizondo op, but when we get that he's being groomed that way, you would kind of expect them to up their game, shall we say. Let's go a little bit further. Tim Burchett, witnesses will be brought in and we will hold hearings on UAPs. You mean UFOs? It's time the American people can handle it. Okay. Burchett, and someone should get this clip to him. You know, one, for people who say that they're out of the government, you have to establish if they have any relationship going on with the government. For example, are you in a contracting position? And then you have to ask them the very important question, if you were part of an op about this for national security grounds, would you lie for the sake of that operation? And that's the point where they'll say, I'll take the fifth because I can't answer the question. It'll tend to incriminate me. That's the way that you have to go into a question like that. You can't just sit there with your mouth open and be like, wow, that's disclosure from the CIA. It's not going to work. So you've been warned. If you want the details, Burchett, on what they have and what's going on there, I'll be happy to give you those details. Let's go a little bit further. And I just want to point this out because I want, in the grand scheme of things, I want all these people who are dealing with it, who are naive in relation to the UFO file because it's not their field of expertise and are being taken for a ride by the CIA. I want them to have this information. Schellenberger. U.S. has 12 or more alien spacecrafts, says military intelligence contractors. Now, this is very interesting because contractors are in an interesting position. Professor Scott points out contractors as a big key of how they run the deep state. Because if you have the CIA on one hand, but then you have Booz Allen Hamilton over here, and the CIA can say, well, we're going to do everything up to this, but then we want you to go over here and do this other stuff. And the contracting agencies very often have an incentive to gin up problems, even when there aren't any, because they get paid more that way. So we need to kind of take that in a little bit to say that, oh, you know, I was reporting on these things. A bunch of intelligence people came to me, and now they gave me a number of how many alien craft there are. 12 alien craft in possession. This reminds me of, in The Manchurian Candidate, the lead senator who keeps going after everyone says, there are exactly 109 communists going on in the government. And then he says, there are 300 communists in the government. And then he says, there's 25 communists. And they're like, what's the number? So finally he settles on 57 because that's the number of the ketchup flavors they have. So, hey, you got 12 alien spacecraft. There you go. They put a number on it. Of course, you know, it's impossible. They might as well have said 250, you know, why not? And the thing is, what they're doing is they're using real stuff, which is the fact that we certainly do have crashed craft, but they're not going to let you see it. And it's interesting because guys like Schellenberger are out there going like, you know, we're going to get into those facilities and look at the stuff. They're so far ahead of you. I mean, you don't even realize that there's a massive underground base structure that you're standing on. And intelligence people don't want to give you information to give to the public, you know, that would threaten their power base. So this is more of that naive reporting that we see. And I think it's more forgivable when you get into those little Fox News situations and they have, you know, somebody like Mellon come on and he just snows them for the entire interview because this is part of the program. This is what they want to bring forward. They want the UFO threat because they're going to need an emergency powers because a lot of the game is up in so many different ways. I mean, how long can you keep this situation up without sort of a kind of a French Revolution type scenario? I mean, you're running into a lot of trouble on the ground. You're running into trouble with banks. You're running into trouble with, you know, allegations about bribery and things at the highest level of the presidency. And you're dealing with all these issues. The deep state is desperate to keep their enemies out of the White House. So they're doing strange things in relation to Trump that, you know, go far beyond anything that we've ever seen in the country before, even with presidents who were up to their necks in things like Nixon. They never try to put Nixon in prison. You know, it didn't happen. So we're in a whole different ballgame. We have to realize that they're charging out the UFO threat piece and trying to legitimize it through these people for that very same reason. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is JFK Cog UFO campaign 2024 government secrets revealed. I'm going to get more into the interaction between the UFO file and continuity of government. And we're going to take your questions coming up here in about a half hour or so. With that in mind, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Kontiki Man says TTSA had a lot of people connected to SRI. Does this mean we have to reconsider Jacques Vallée, who is connected to SRI?
What was the first part about SRI?
TTSA had a lot of people connected to SRI.
No, I think that, you know, just like TTSA got Peter Levenda or whatever, they actually almost got Joseph Farrell to work with them because what's his name, DeLong got Farrell on the phone. He wanted him to be part of it.
It was a close one.
They didn't want Farrell because he hated Hillary. So he dodged a bullet. But, if you're a writer out there and a corporation comes along and says, I want you to write books about UFOs, it probably sounds like a pretty good deal to people, and they don't go into those deeper levels. But some of the characters in the middle of all that, who were working with TTSA, the CIA people who set it up, and all the rest, some of them were suspects from the beginning. And it was interesting because I would point out, well, that's a CIA organization. And you'd have all the UFO researchers saying, oh, that's negative to call them CIA. It's in their bio. I don't understand. Like, there's a lot of weird disconnects going on. Gary Nolan, I get this all the time, of course, with Nolan. And it's a wonderful thing to put this out there because it's in his bio. He's worked with the CIA for over a decade. That's his testimony about how they came to him and said, hey, weird things happen with people's brains when they have these UFO encounters. We want you to study it. All right. He's a CIA guy. He shouted out to Fauci, so those are things that I've proved on the program, but it's interesting because there's a lot of cognitive dissonance to get through because people can't believe it. They were like, you mean this is a CIA program, to dumb us down and get us ready for an emergency UFO takeover? I mean, it is. It's a lot to take. It's much easier to just think, hey, we're finally getting disclosure now. But look at the 3 years you just lived through, where they completely upended your entire lives. And they had an excuse. The excuse was this thing, got loose and you have to do all these things or you lose your job. Basically stay in your house. You're going to get locked in your house or you're in trouble. So that was the level, the grip on the world that they had. What do you think they're going to do with the next big threat? I mean, the UFO threat is a pretty good, it's a great story, right? And they've been working on it for 80 years. So yeah, they're going to want to use it. What else you got?
Rotten crypto bits. Does every generation get a new and improved dose or repeat of UFO mania to keep the narrative alive till the final card?
Well, don't forget that there's a possibility that when you are running the fake UFO invasion, that the real thing shows up. This is it. So when you get into that mindset, we have to remember the phenomena is real after all. What they are doing isn't. What they want to do is create a threat around something that's actually out there. They also like the idea of the narratives they can spin around this mystery because they can make it into anything they want. But that doesn't discredit the actual testimony of people who've had genuine UFO experiences or the subject itself. This is the thing I try to put across in the program, which is that the UFO file is a gigantic mystery. This is something that may go back to primeval times. And this may go back to our Atlantean roots, which is also a gigantic disclosure that you bet your life they're planning on distorting. And they're already inserting Atlantis-style distortion into the narrative about the UFOs because they're not so sure about the UFO threat at times. They're like, maybe we can pretend that there's an advanced Atlantean race under the water that's doing this, and the USOs are actually the threat. Well, it's interesting because they have evidence on their side of a very old advanced culture that existed in the Atlantic Ocean that was so advanced as put forward by Edgar Cayce that it made the technology that we have, seem primitive by comparison. They had the ability with their airships to fly through things. You figure that one out. There's some apophthegm for you. And believe it or not, Edgar Cayce comes up tonight in the context of UFOs, even though he never gave any outright readings about UFOs because he died in 1945, 2 years shy of the big UFO craze. So we missed out on the ability to talk to him about it, although he does, in fact, mention not only Atlantean airships, but also visitors. So there's a lot of information there to tie together. I tie him together with James McDonald and Admiral Hillenkotter. So this is going to get interesting. A little more on what's going on with the UFO thing. House oversight plans UFO hearing after unconfirmed claims of crashed alien spacecraft. This is how they're spinning it, but it's true that this Grush said, hey, we've got crashed pilots and all this stuff. So he is going different. He's going into a different track of exposition. And apparently he didn't tell, this was the great part of the whole op, which is that Leslie Kean, who's been in the middle of all this, she wrote the original dodgy New York Times article, which introduced the false whistleblower Elizondo and pretended that he didn't work for the government. All these people are in the government. And she now came back with the same Blumenthal guy, and they're writing this follow-up piece, which has Grush in it. And it's all about Grush is going to release this, Grush is going to release that. And then he goes and talks to Russ Coulthart, and they do this whole video thing, and comes out, and he starts talking about stuff that he didn't mention to her, like alien pilots, all this kind of stuff. And she's like, well, I didn't hear anything about this, and I don't talk about alien pilots because that's, I'm here to talk about the real things about it. And it's really funny because if you look at Leslie Kean, you know that she was with Bud Hopkins for 12 years. She was his partner for so many years. And his whole thing was he was the king of abductions. That's his whole bag. And she never mentions him or any of his work. But his whole thing was about, the people who were inside the craft, not the craft themselves. So this is important. Now, House Oversight plans UFO hearing. We've got the hearing coming up. We've got CIA players involved, like John Brennan, who believes we should really dig in on that UFO subject and that we're going to find a different life form and all that. Yeah, this paragon of virtue there from the CIA. As we know, the Drone King, whose big claim to fame is he loved to blow up people at wedding parties in the Middle East. Now, Van Herk is why I come around to all this. So we have all the UFO reports and all the rest of it. In the middle of it, you've got America's UFO mystery. You don't have Joe Biden out there talking about it. You don't have the Joint Chiefs. You've got General Van Herk. And Van Herk is your man. He's the one who, if there's a UFO threat, he has the COG capacity to become the leader. And he becomes the combatant commander of the United States in the event of an emergency of that magnitude. And he appoints regional governors, no elections, nothing like that. He says, this guy governs that territory, this guy governs that territory. That's inside the COG mandate, which is why the UFO threat piece is so dangerous. Some of the interesting trial balloon aspects around this happened, as I said, during the unidentified shoot downs going on when they started the year like this. We're calling them objects, not balloons, for a reason. U.S. on shooting down unidentified object. And there were a number of headlines with him where it said UFO shoot down, UFO shoot down. That was to get that placed in our subconscious for when it happens. This guy knew very well when they said, why don't you just tell us, you were shooting down a balloon? And they said, unless, was it something else? Was it aliens? And he said, I'm not going to say what it was, so he knew that the whole implication, being a general and being careful with his words for his whole life, he knew very well the implication of suggesting it this way. So we find ourselves then in a weird situation where the PSYOP is brewing and the COG members are now coming out straight to the public and being like, aha, I'm in charge, there's a UFO shoot down. That's the dangerous things. And while we're in a situation where we're not under siege of phony objects flying up there in a military response, we need to figure out what the plans of COG are, who are the personnel at this point, deep analysis of what this administration is doing around the idea of an emergency UFO threat. Would they use it to even stop the 2024 election? They might. They might. There was a paper that circulated from a Hillary Clinton campaign aide in 2016 where they talked about different scenarios that would prevent Trump supporters from going to the polls. Believe it or not, UFO invasion was one of them, was one of the scenarios that they were thinking, could that be drummed up in some way to stop them from going to the polls? So they think on these levels, and I think it's valuable for us to kind of get on the same track. But there's a history to this. There's a deep history to COG UFO and the assassination programs of the Central Intelligence Agency, the secrecy programs around the development of the technology, the X-Protect group, the whole thing goes back. It's got an 8-decade history. So there's a lot for us to work with. I want to just point out the piece about Hillenkotter, that I think this is going to be important as we go forward here, to remember that there were people who got in the middle of this, like Thomas Townsend Brown, NICAP, the original group investigating UFOs. And these are the people I refer to as the X-share people. They're familiar with the X technology, they're familiar with the UFO file, and what they want to do is they want the culture to move forward as a result of this discovery. So the X-share people operate on that side. The JFK piece is very much along that line. The X-Protect people are all about keeping the wall of secrecy in place, and they have lots of good excuses for that. But the problem is they've gathered so much energy, resources, advantages, scientific accomplishments on their side that they now see themselves as, progenitors of a god race. And this is where, this whole thing being mixed with the AI concept and the Davos crowd and this whole piece of a central governing body, augmenting humanity. And, forget about the fact that you have a soul. You're now just an animal in the WEF kingdom. And this is the real rhetoric that they've been rolling out there. There's a reason for that. And there's a reason for the level of insanity that they're showing around this. There's a kind of trauma attached to it. And built into it, though, is this UFO mystery. It's operating inside of this. And you have a push-pull between the groups that are operating to release the information. And I would say that the group that gets behind releasing the genuine disclosure for 2024 around the presidential campaign, it's going to be crucial. That because they're going to initiate a false disclosure. If you can get the real thing going, you can get past the phony hearings thing with the phony whistleblower, past the CIA part, and get to the real thing, then you're going to be in a much better position. That's what we're looking at here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight, JFK COG UFO campaign 2024. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. Admiral Hillenkotter, Miss Olivia, before I get into the Admiral, what do you got?
The Philip K. Dick Film Festival. Can you comment on the Antarctica superweapon that was reported during the Greer disclosure event? Brenda Fisher says, his discussion of the power source in Antarctica took me back to Dr. JPF's comments about the Great Pyramid.
Oh, isn't that interesting? The superweapon. This is very interesting. Of course, we know in 1903 that Nikola Tesla caused an earthquake in Manhattan. And he did it on a dare because he said, well, with this technology, you could do that. And they laughed him off. And he said, I'll prove it to you. And he did. He caused an earthquake. The ability to cause earthquakes and natural disasters and all the rest of it has long been rumored, shall we say. And it was admitted to by William Cohen in testimony in 2000, who was a defense secretary, who was a Republican, but he was under Clinton. And when he admitted it, he said, if terrorist groups got a hold of this weather modification technology, we'd be, it'd be a big problem. So he let out the fact that we have it. But it's been rumored for a long time. So you just go one level deeper and you have the earthquake causing technology, upsetting the grid and all the rest of it. This whistleblower, Hecker, who spent time with Warner and talked about his time in Antarctica, was way more believable and important than Grush, in my opinion. So I'm glad that came out, and that came out via the Greer piece. So that was one of the highlights of that. And I think we're going to have to watch that story develop. But basically what he was saying, that the group that was involved with doing it was the defense contractor Raytheon. And that basically it was the earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand, that was the result of them flipping on the switch for this thing in Antarctica. So obviously you're going to have to go deeper in that story, but do we have technology like that? Yes, most definitely. Go ahead.
Contiki Man says, UK hacker Gary McKinnon stated he saw data about a USS spaceship Hillenkotter in 2001 makes me wonder about what JPF said about stalemating aliens in the 1980s.
That gets you to the Corso work. But that's what Farrell is referring to. And that's interesting because when they've been talking about like, oh, we've never had an intelligence officer come forward before and talk about aliens. It seems like almost all the people who've talked about aliens and intelligence officers. Jesse Marcel was an intelligence officer. So that whole PR pitch around Grush is completely untrue. We've had, dozens of them, probably more. I think maybe 40 or 50 different guys who've identified themselves as intelligence agents coming off and talking about this. So that's weird too, that they wanted to spin this as some new thing. Just like when they spun the whole thing in the New York Times, they were like, oh my God, there's something flying in the sky. I mean, we've had the UFO thing on the front pages since 1947. We've had it a lot longer than that. But, what is this weird Mandela effect of trying to kind of memory hole that stuff? Because the other stuff suggests a large scale cover up and includes a lot of organic observation about the phenomena, which is missing from this whole discussion. A lot of the discussion that came out of the pilots that were engineered by the TTSA to come out and talk, it was all about, oh my God, the speed of this thing, the G-force or whatever. And that's a different that is one of those military scale questions. I mean, it's interesting on one level, but when you think about how the UFO question has come into, for example, psychic experience, or has altered time, people have missing time and have to go and get hypnotized to find out where that time was, what happened to them, that there's mind control involved in some of the cases, forced amnesia. I mean, there's a number of things which don't come up in relation to just, pilots chasing an object. So, we have to look at it from a full spectrum to get any idea of what's going on there. What I've put forward on this program is that there's a quality inside the UFOs, which is the apothium quality. That's APOTHEUM. And the apothium quality is basically a reality distortion field. It upsets the normal physical reality, so it introduces a distortion physics. And they haven't been able to control that part from what I can tell. And this is part of the problem with the secrecy around the UFO thing. They've kept the information around off-world cultures and things, relics that they've discovered on other planets. So they've kept a lot of those secrets, but I think the absolute wall of secrecy is in place because of the apothium factor. And you can track the apothium thing without any government disclosure at all. Just go and look at the literature about what has happened to people. It was interesting. I was reading some of these Ray Fowler stories, and I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that one of those stories is this couple coming back into Leominster, Massachusetts, and they're driving and they're over a graveyard. They see a UFO hovering, and it has this massive, incredibly fog situation, all this smoke around, and their car is turning off, turning on, turning off, turning on. So they stop, and the guy gets out to see what's going on. His wife says, "Don't go near that thing." And as he's moving towards it, he gets paralyzed a little every foot closer to the thing. He gets more paralyzed, so that he tries to kind of hobble back to the car, and he feels out of sorts the whole time. And he'll get into a car accident later that night. So there's so many effects around it. Think about the whole UFO thing. That when UFOs land, nothing grows in those fields where they land. So there's something that is involved with the whole UFO factor that goes way beyond just how fast they are. And it seems like in terms of speed, there are no limits to what they can do, and that we can't chase them, that chasing them is a joke because they can just blink out at any time. So there is a genuine mystery there. I'm not against any of that exploration. This is what I think we ought to be doing. But what they're trying to do is it's almost like having writers in the background who say, how can we best get the best UFO threat scenario, write it out, and then roll these people out, and you could either use the people and prep them. You can say to them, well, this is what actually happened. And you can use a lot of false whistleblowers to them so that they think, like the Schellenberger guy, think that they have the inside story, because all these UFO intelligence officers show up and say, I'm going to tell you about the real UFO thing. And, we're keeping them in this hangar, and you can go to Congress and get answers that way. They're setting you up to do the heavy work that they don't want to do about putting the UFO threat out there, So you have to get really smart when you deal around it. What you're dealing with, it's almost like a mystical thing right off the bat. You have to deal with that because there are major psychic components. As a matter of fact, when you go deep into the UFO file, you find that they look in those programs for psychic individuals to operate the craft because they can't seem to reverse engineer it where you can just stick a guy in there and operate a reverse engineered flying saucer. It doesn't work that way. What they learned was that the pilots themselves were integrated into the craft. Somehow the pilot himself was part of the structure of the thing. Now, this is interesting because all the stories that they have this guy Grush spitting out all go back into UFO lore and are the reboots of these different things. And you have all these UFO people saying, oh, that's right. He said it this way because it's true. And that's why we have the history that way. Well, when you get around intelligence exploiting the UFO file, you have to start with the assumption of the opposite. You have to start with the idea that the intelligence agencies are playing you because that's what they've been known to do. It's 5 years later. Do you see an anti-gravity craft from TTSA? Did Lou Elizondo produce anything beyond a lot of stories that made him get a book deal on the cover of GQ Sausage magazine? We have to look at these things in a particular way because this is what we're looking at, that we get these tidbits of things and you don't get, it's basically bitter dregs at the end of it. Look at the whole DeLong thing. Didn't produce absolutely anything except articles in the New York Times of Leslie Kean repeating ideas that Elizondo was a whistleblower. Well, that didn't work out so well. So what happened? Elizondo and his gang went back to work with Mellon and all the rest, and they cooked up Grush. Grush, has a real military history, but they could have told him anything. He doesn't have to go on the record. He has all complete plausible deniability because he said, I didn't touch any of this stuff and I didn't see anything. I just heard about it from these other guys. So you're going to have to go, somebody in that structure is going to have to go out on the line. And, this is the interesting thing about whistleblowers. And we were talking about Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. The level of that real whistleblower, what we understand as whistleblowers, when you look at it for real, the threat is prison. It's court-martial. So that's a whistleblower. I don't see, what's interesting is the military has a process, and Grush went to them and says, I'm going to talk about alien pilots and all the rest of it. And they were like, yes, yeah, baby, go. Don't hold back. And so what does that tell you? They're not worried about it in the slightest. So, they want him to go out there telling his stories. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep tonight on the UFO file. JFK COG UFO campaign 2024. We're going to take your questions here shortly. And Admiral Hillenkotter, you got something there, Miss Olivia?
A few things. Michael Snow says, if Grush is so highly cleared and everyone's coming to him, why is he speaking of seeing pictures and not firsthand viewing? And a physicist, it says nuclear as opposed to nuclear, which I noticed also. Jocelyn Buckner says, the problem with Grush is that his whistleblowing isn't first person. And Ray Story says, Grush, he's only 36. How did he get on the fast track?
Well, he retired at 36.
Okay.
When did he retire? 3 years ago? I forget. But basically, I think that there's a lot of unanswered questions with Grush. And the thing to do, the congressional hearings piece, would be to put the CIA in the spotlight and say, are you running a program running these false whistleblowers to create a UFO threat? So Burchett should be looking at that angle of it. Also, there are people still alive who were running UFO programs around X-Protect and all the rest of that, like Bobby Inman, somebody I've suggested you could put under oath and you would get a very interesting testimony from. Other guys who would probably volunteer it, for example, Watergate lawyer Douglas Caddy. This is somebody who put on the record that his friend, E. Howard Hunt, the top spy for the CIA, top CIA operator, and came out of OPC, he said that President Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. Well, if you want to really open this subject up, open up the JFK files. That would be the answer on that one. Okay, let's talk to the Admiral for a moment. Hillenkotter is interesting for a number of reasons, but he went through Pearl Harbor and he was injured during Pearl Harbor. So he's a super patriot, and he was used on the Majestic 12 boards to analyze the whole UFO question. And he got very much like Forrestal into this headset of, kind of a headspace of, well, you can't just keep this secret, like this doesn't work. And he started to realize that people were manipulating that whole process. Now, when they forced this whole CIA program on our friend Truman, he went to his friend, his fellow Missourian, and he said, I want you to be CIA director. Later, Dulles and the whole gang got in. But originally, this guy was the first one out of the gate, and he wanted to deal with the UFO file. So inside that administration, you had Forrestal, and you had Truman, and you had Hillenkotter. So you had the possibility of opening this up. And there are even press conferences with Truman talking about UFOs and saying, like, we don't know what they are, but they don't seem to be a threat, which is exactly what the CIA didn't want to hear. Now, what happens is he gets out of that position and he hooks up with James McDonald, who is an up-and-coming physicist, very interested in the UFO file, who realizes something weird is going on as well. McDonald will meet a weird end at the hands of the X-Protect group because he gets too close to things. And, he tries to rebut the whole Robertson panel defaming of the UFO topic. And he meets a very unsavory end, but I'll save that. A couple of things here just to get us in the right headspace on this. Now, Donald Kehoe was big on this in the late 50s, driving the point home that there was a silence group. This is the X-Protect group that they're referring to, who was sitting on the UFO file, creating secrecy, creating hoaxes, and all the rest, just like the group that's operating now. Kehoe received from NICAP board member Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter a signed statement in which Hillenkotter urged immediate congressional action on the dangers of UFO secrecy, specifically the accidental war that could result from UFO formations being mistaken by Soviet surprise attack. This is the same thing that President Kennedy brought to his CIA director and said, I want us to share the high threat UFO cases with the Soviets because we don't want a nuclear exchange over this. That was November 12th in the director's memo that he sent, and he gets assassinated 10 days later because that group didn't want to share anything with the Russians. Now, here's Hillenkotter saying exactly the same thing. Here, the danger that the Soviets might claim that the Russian weapons against which our defenses were helpless. Hillenkotter's warning was part of a NICAP report on secrecy dangers, which contained verified evidence of radar visual and photographic cases and was endorsed by more than 200 pilots. You see how long this has been going on? This report is from 1960. This is the year that Kennedy's running, by the way. And astronomers, military veterans. This report was distributed confidentially to several members of Congress, including then Senator Lyndon Johnson. Parts of it were put into their congressional record. Okay, so this whole thing is moving, and they're right on the verge of getting these hearings. They've moved the ball forward. And even LBJ, who they call Senator NASA, is like, all right, make those boys answer some of those questions about UFOs. And Senator Lyndon Johnson ordered the Senate Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee to keep close watch on UFO developments and on Air Force investigations of recent significant sightings. But the House, not the Senate, eventually acted. In May of 1961, the House Space Committee formed a subcommittee to study the UFO problem. And the members decided that open hearings should be held. We're going to have open hearings. Okay, it's 2023. This is 1961. Do the math. 62 years later, right? They never opened anything up. And the open hearings had been decided on. They should be held. They were right on the verge of doing so. Then something weird happens. You ready? Suddenly and inexplicably, Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter abruptly resigned from NICAP's Board of Governors, stating, "In my opinion, NICAP's investigation has gone as far as possible. I know UFOs are not U.S. or Soviet devices. The Air Force cannot do any more under the circumstances, and I believe we should not continue to criticize their investigations." The flat statement negated a great part of NICAP's work in the eyes of the congressman, and the hearing plans collapsed. Kehoe and all NICAP members were astounded at the setback and Hillenkotter's comments. Hillenkotter, they got to him and said, you really put the UFO thing on the spot. What's interesting is this whole process happens in 1961. 2 years later, Kennedy gets assassinated over the same issue. The tensions around the UFO file are huge. This is a former CIA director working with Thomas Townsend Brown and others in NICAP, putting this forward. They have the information. So therefore, you're in a totally different dynamic going on here. When we get to these people, when they get to shut him down, and then eventually what will happen, it'll take a few years, but they're going to bump off McDonald as well. So these people who force the issue and really bring it out there, they meet with this very unusual end. Our friend Hillenkotter, he'll live till 1982, but he'll never say anything else about the UFO file. They got to him pretty clearly on that. The question is, what were they afraid was going to come out in 1961? I wanted to say this about just a weird little side note, that many of you who've watched this program know all about the Edgar Cayce readings. And one of the weird stories I did was about Edgar Cayce in Arizona. And Cayce had this incredible kind of mystical encounter when he went to Arizona. And he went there with the person who invented FM radio. And this guy ended up actually building a big transmitter that's still on top of the Prue here in Boston. And the guy was very young. He was like 22 years old. And I think Cayce was in his 40s. And they both took off from Virginia and drove to Arizona. And as soon as they got to Arizona, where the readings told them to go, because this was a whole thing about the Atlanteans and where the Atlanteans used to mine their crystals and lapis lazuli. And they go to this mine in Arizona, and this is this whole story about it. And I think I did the episode probably last fall, something like that. But this is one of those key stories. While they're driving there, they have a number of things happen. Cayce, in fact, has 5 flat tires in one day. And but when they get there, all these very incredibly strange, mystical things happen. Now, when I was reading through McDonald and how McDonald got into the UFO field, because James McDonald is one of those key guys. He's like a J. Allen Hynek in this sense, that he put things on the record and he brought the real thing on, and then the establishment moved against him. But he was somebody who was a key factor in the UFO piece. Now, the earliest notes available from McDonald concern a mechanical engineer named Jack Craig from Bisbee, Arizona, a town 90 miles southeast of Tucson. Bisbee is where Cayce and the FM radio guy went and had all these bizarre experiences and found the Singing Stone. Now, the craft was flying 300 feet above the ground. It emitted a white smoke for a brief time, but no flame or lights were seen. It climbed higher as it flew south over Mexico and disappeared off into the distance. The first account was fragmentary, but the second unexplainable case, which came to McDonald's attention, was far from brief. It was reported by dozens of citizens to Tucson newspapers, radio, and TV stations, and with such broad interest and complexity that it presented a challenge to him. His first journal, which includes a 4-part account of his investigation of the event, is 44 handwritten pages long, and he goes deep into it. What's interesting is he follows the wave of sightings from Bisbee to a town called Nogales on the border of Arizona and Mexico.
I think it's Nogales.
Nogales, that's it. And the what's interesting about the border incident there is this is the exact track that Casey will take from Bisbee using the readings. They will direct him directly from Bisbee to Nogales. So there's something very strange that 10 years later, here's McDonald getting into the UFO thing because of these sightings crisscrossing in the exact same area that Casey and this FM radio developer took off for. I found that just very interesting, shall we say. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Okay, we're going to take your questions here shortly, and I'll pepper in some things as we go. But the Casey connection, let's not forget, Casey had a lot to say in relation to Atlantean craft, saying that the Atlanteans developed very advanced flying craft, and that what Ezekiel saw back in the Bible, well, he said it was not ET at all, or it wasn't what it presumed to be. He actually said this is one of the Atlantean crafts, but it was a much later date that Ezekiel was looking at it, meaning someone was keeping that technology. Quite fascinating. Whenever we get around Casey, you can feel you're right on the precipice of big answers when you get around the Casey work, and so much of it kept right there in Virginia Beach. Now, Miss Olivia, why don't we jump into your questions at this point? And it's up to you.
Susan Blackstone says, read The Day After Roswell. It explains how they got the technology into the mainstream.
Yeah, he did. And, that is Corso's book. And he talks about the different things that they got from the crafts and how they moved it into different industries. What I found interesting is he talks about how he told the companies, the corporations, it's okay to file the patents. This is part of the deal that they had. But this is how they rolled very limited aspects of the UFO file out to industry. And I think it was just to create the ability to hold the secrecy intact, because the secrecy was required on such a level that a private company could keep it. But if it was really part of the government, at a certain point, that secrecy level would collapse. So they kept it in a quasi-corporate political situation. So if it was inside the defense contractors, if Boeing or Lockheed had it, you and I couldn't get at it, because you and I, although we can demand that the government give us answers on things, we can't demand a private corporation do the same. So, this is the thinking around that. And certainly I think what Corso said about that was absolutely true. You have to remember that part of the theme of this whole thing is that the breakaways now, those who've created the technology, harbored it for 8 decades here, they're breaking back in. They have the stuff now. Now they need to rule with it, and experience the incredible public response that they can get from this. But the idea, in my opinion, is the way that they want to break back in is through the threat. They want the threat to be there and exercise, and then they can say, in response to this UFO threat, we're going to reveal this advanced technology that we have. And that's when you're going to get deep into it. And I don't think it's far off. That's the thing.
Northern Lights. Why wouldn't another nation come clean with their own UFO files?
Well, it's asked a lot. There are countries like France and Brazil who've put out comprehensive UFO reports.
Right, the Cometa report.
Right. Yes. And a lot of them don't have the scientific knowledge base of the United States or Russia. United States and Russia are the two top countries dealing with it. India and China studying space, sending things up there, and Israel has stolen information in relation to the UFO file. And they've developed, their own space thing that they have going on. But when you get around this, it's interesting because the director of the Israeli space program was retired. He came out and said, "Oh, Trump knows all about aliens," but he was going to actually release information about it, but they told him, "Oh, the world's not ready for us yet." And this guy, basically, he might as well have been the retired NASA director. I mean, it was kind of amazing, his little diatribe there, and it's on the record. So there are some weird loopholes out there that might open the situation up rather dramatically. And as we know, Trump, his family not only has the John Trump aspect to it, but if you go back into those German aerospace groups very early on, you've got the same thing going on, with Trump being very involved and that family being involved in 19th century aerospace. So there's something deep there, and that gets us into the whole Del Shao airship piece with the big Trump 45 thing in the middle and Trump train and things of that nature. How else are you going to say that? It's somebody looking forward. It's somebody's visioning, remote viewing the future. And I think there's a reason they tied him in directly with that. Trump's knowledge base around the UFO file is part of the reason why on a presidential level there's so much opposition to him, because they feel like they're dealing with somebody on equal ground across the table, and these people are used to holding all the secrets. So, on the surface you have this, unruly America first real estate billionaire and all the rest of it, but you dig a little bit deeper and you got aerospace all over, including the Space Force, which still is a remarkable feat. I mean, have we even caught up to what Space Force is all about? I mean, this is incredible. So that is a direct attempt to pull the UFO file back under executive control. It's unmistakable. I promised you a New York Times article, and this is February 28th, 1960. Air Force order on saucers cited. New York Times. It quotes Hillenkotter. Let's just read a little bit of this. Go back to your questions. Pamphlet by the Inspector General. Sound familiar? Inspector General is the same person inside the intelligence community that Lou Elizondo complained to get all these things on the record. Grush, who did he go to? He went to the intelligence community, Inspector General. February 27th, 1960. The Air Force has sent its commands a warning to treat sightings of unidentified flying objects as serious business. Directly related to the nation's defenses, it was learned today. An Air Force spokesman confirmed issuance of the directive after portions of it were made public by a private flying saucer group, NICAP. The new regulations were issued by Air Force Inspector General December 24th. The regulations revising similar ones issued in the past outlined procedures and said that investigations and analysis of UFOs are directly related to the Air Force's responsibility for the defense of the United States. So much for, they don't pose any threat to national security, so we stop studying them. Existence of the document was revealed by the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Privately financed committee accused the Air Force of deception in publicly describing reports of UFOs as delusions and hoaxes while sending the private admonition to its commands. Well, that tells you a lot, doesn't it? They're not hallucinations. Vice Admiral R.H. Hillenkotter, a committee board member and former director of the CIA, said in a statement that a copy of the Inspector General's warning has been sent to the Senate Science and Astronautics Committee. Quote, "It is time for the truth to be brought out in open congressional hearings," he said. The Air Force confirmed that the document has been issued. A spokesman said it was put out by Major General Richard E. O'Keefe, acting Inspector General at the time, to call attention to the revised Air Force regulations concerning UFOs. The statement was included in an operations and training pamphlet. Pentagon aides said the new regularities and regulations covering 7 printed pages, made no substantive change in policy. The Air Force has investigated 6,300 reports of flying objects since 1947, and so on. But here it says, the latest Air Force statement issued a month ago said no physical material evidence, not even a minute fragment of a so-called flying saucer, has ever been found. That's interesting. I think he doth protest too much there. Admiral Hillenkotter said that behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about UFOs. Quote, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. He charged that to hide the facts, the Air Force has silenced its personnel through the issuance of regulations. And that's, there's the ex protect in action. So Hillenkotter was going after them there in February 1960. By May 61, he jumps ship right as Congress is going to have hearings and all the rest of it. But there you can see, again, we need to have congressional hearings and the whole push around the UFO thing in that period. And they didn't want any real resolution. Now, these people on the CIA side with the whistleblowers, they want congressional hearings because it's always a kind of a weird reverse mockery of the original thing. And what they want to use is, we're the victims, we're the whistleblowers, and this is the kind of weird, sick process that goes on when you're planning these types of psychological operations. The question is, when they get the Congress, the congressional piece, does something get out of their hands? In other words, who knows? Here's a wild scenario. Okay, so Burchett is really sharp. Let's suppose he's just really sharp in this whole thing. And Burchett calls me in the background, and I tell him, this is exactly what you asked Grush. Here are the 6 bullet points. And he surprises Grush in that, and Grush falls apart in his testimony. That would expose the CIA op. Do you see what I mean? So this is how something like that could work and blow up in their face. Because if they can find themselves in a situation where they're not given softball questions, where it's not like the George Knapp, are you a hero or a legend or a legendary hero? Choose one. And, some of the classic Elizondo interviews will live forever, where Lou says, well, I'm just doing it for humanity. I'll take my lumps while my family watches me suffer. It's okay, George, no problem. So if it's going to work like that, it's just a waste of a hearing. But if Burchett has an edge, and if he watches the X series, then he's all set. Okay, go for it.
Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, at what point does Trump spill his guts about everything? Jocelyn Buckner says that Trump has not been forthcoming about COVID, and the vax makes me think that RFK Jr. will be more transparent and honest about the UFO file between the two.
Well, Trump's pretty ticked off. And he just, this thing about throwing him in prison, he said, I'm going to destroy the deep state now. So, Trump knows where a lot of the bodies are buried. Let's not forget. The Kennedy family does too. I think that Kennedy is a born transparency candidate. And he is coming from a place of transparency and a place of leadership. So I think, when we get into the deeper levels of this subject, then, both of those candidates have a very large transparency fingerprint. The thing about, Trump has certain advantages because he was in the White House, because he knows the machinations of 4 years of being there. That's one type of advantage. The other type of advantage is, Bobby Kennedy is coming from a very ethical place on all this, and he's got the family background. That's incredible knowledge base to walk into the presidency with. He has the resources through the family and his own connections over the years to call on different people to be defense secretary, secretary of state, and all the rest. So we're getting into interesting territory. But yeah, I would say what I see is that force, again, coming in on one side. It's Trump coming in on one side, and over here is the Bobby Kennedy Camelot force coming in, and in the middle is the Biden administration getting smashed by the weight of these two forces. And what I see is the DNC trying to come up with a hat trick like Gavin Newsom or something like that. But the Biden administration is going to be, there's no question that on a political level, they're in a very vulnerable position, and he's stumbling around. He's run by committee. I mean, it's not a real candidacy. He's not a real president. So we have to keep that in mind as we go. Yes.
The weed in your garden. ET themselves will never allow disclosure. That is assuming that there is only one group of ETs among us.
Yeah. I think that there is a wild card thing with the actual when we get outside of the CIA crazy op thing, where they like to do psyops and control your brain and like electronic MK Ultra and all the rest of it. When we get outside of that and just think of the actual situation of the potential of off-world visitors, the potential of ancient technology and things of this nature, the whole thing opens up. But if you're trying to compress how people think about something, you run the risk of looking like a fool, because the UFO thing is not in the control of the Central Intelligence Agency. All that they control is the UFO file. And the actual UFO phenomena is a totally different thing. So, you have aspects in that UFO file about the phenomena, and the X-Tech resides, remember, inside the UFO file. It contains things that go directly to Tesla technology as well. What kind of technology were the mystery schools keeping? John Keeley, what did Keeley send to Annie Besant from the Theosophical Society before he died? And they try to chase his partner to see, like, what are you doing with this high-end technology? Well, there were reports about Keeley that he had demonstrated in the 1890s planes that could go 500 miles an hour. So, the Wright brothers and all that kind of stuff becomes like a weird, flimsy public rollout of the fact that we have flight. The real thing, is a lot older. Go for it.
Guangalist Bygone. Based on Greer's declarations to the press corps, does DJ believe the Rockefeller influence with the push for full disclosure in the Clinton White House to be legit and genuine? What was happening in the 90s?
I do think that Lawrence Rockefeller was in a position where he wanted to get things about UFOs on the record. So I think he was an unusual character among the Rockefellers. And I think when he died, that influence went out too. So I made that point earlier about you can have threads inside a family that are totally different from what the family is known for, and I think that Lawrence Rockefeller and his presence around the UFO file, the Rockefellers try to get around everything, by the way. So they try to get around the Sumerian legends. They try to get around archaeology. They try to get around the UFO thing. So I think that there's an aim around those families to control historical origins, the origin story of humanity, the Atlantis story, and keep us in a very narrow idea about who we are and what we are. So that's part of what they're about. And it's part of what they've been able to keep while they survey these things in the background. I mean, why was Carnegie so obsessed about dinosaur ruins, and why did he develop the most amazing collection around that? Well, there's a reason. There's a reason for it that goes deeper than just, hey, he's fascinated with a dinosaur. No, he also collected Egyptian ruins. There was something about his obsession about it, which gets us into interesting territory, because if you go deep on some of the mystery school literature, you're going to find that it looks like, although the dinosaurs were around millions of years ago, that they were reanimated in a much more recent period, to the point where in the Casey readings, he said that we needed to let out gigantic death rays in 50,722 BC to get rid of them, because they were overrunning humanity, because basically the Atlantean scientists had reanimated this Jurassic Park situation. That's deep. that's deep. And, we have a lot of people still walking around thinking that civilization started in Samaria, 4000 BC. When the pyramids now and the Sphinx and all that, they go back. We already have weather aspects on the Sphinx, which have told us since the 90s that goes back to what? At least 10,000 BC, probably more like 30, 40, 50,000
Right.
BC.
Well, and we have Göbekli Tepe, right?
Right now we have that. Yeah. So when Casey and Steiner and people of this ilk are putting it out there and saying, hey, 10,500 BC, it's in their period, in their time, it's a joke. And the Egyptologists can laugh them off and say, like, we have a very detailed lineage of kings, but their stories don't make any sense. That's an old science. They probably know on a much deeper level the actual dating of these things, but they hold on to it as kind of a Darwin-esque religion. Yeah, so we need to move beyond the stories that they've given us. I'm going to tell you something weird too, which is I've brought up Luis Alvarez before, and Alvarez is interesting because he's involved in the Robertson panel around the UFO aspect, and he's a physicist. He will be also the person who shows up in this unusual capacity of trying to debunk the multiple shooter scenario in the Zapruder film, and they'll make him the photo analyst. Well, he checked it through physics. Well, I also told you that he's the person who used cosmic rays to try to find secret chambers inside the pyramid. So this guy is a real X-player. One of the things I found out about him, and it's unusual, and I had a whole section that I was going to bring out about him, but I'm going to save most of this for another episode. But one thing I will say about Alvarez is he's credited with the discovery that the dinosaurs were wiped out 65 million years ago. So when you're dealing on these levels with things, and he's a deep player who was involved in the obfuscation of the Kennedy assassination, he was involved in the obfuscation of the UFO file. Why is he going to give us the truth about dinosaurs when they were wiped out? So there's something weird operational there. And I'm going to tell you something else about Alvarez, which is I told you there was an unusual connection with Kennedy and who he was going to meet at the Trade Mart. There was this whole ceremony planned with Lloyd Berkner, who was also on the Robertson panel. And Berkner, we went into his Antarctica history, but he had worked with McDonald later, and I'll refresh some people's memory, but Lloyd Berkner is one of these very unusual figures floating deep inside the scientific establishment. He went to Antarctica with Admiral Byrd, and then later he was the go-to person. He was on MJ-12, and he was deep on the UFO file. So Kennedy, in fact, was going to meet him at the Trade Mart. Those two were going to have a ceremony, and Kennedy wanted the flag that flew over the White House to present to him. And they were going to make, according to Berkner, a statement that would ring bells all over the world, internationally and everywhere. So they were going to say something, and I'd like to say that they were going to do a UFO disclosure. But what's probably more likely is they were going to announce a joint moon mission with the Russians. What's interesting about that is Alvarez was scheduled to also get the National Medal of Science in the same ceremony. So you have those weird players from the Robertson panel were the people that Kennedy was going to meet there in Dallas at the Trade Mart as he gets assassinated. It's unusual, to say the least, that he's going to meet Berkner. And then if you put Alvarez on top of that, I found that in Alvarez's bio when I was reading it. But he did, in fact, get the medal. And what's interesting is if you look at the picture, and I'll go deeper into this in the next episode, but if you look at the picture of him getting the medal from LBJ, who's now president because Kennedy's been assassinated, who's hanging out right there, but they're retired, but very active Vannevar Bush, who, after all, controlled the UFO file. Let me give you some of these people here. Right there, you have Alvarez. That's LBJ presenting it to him. And there's our friend, Vannevar Bush, in charge of the UFO file. It's kind of extraordinary when you think about it, but the UFO file has been weaving in and out of our government and in our geopolitics throughout this whole situation. And, when I've gotten into the scenario around the hot zone and the Atlantean ruins there, I'm going to tell you that the hot zone is, of all those different areas around the world, is an incredible vortex of UFO sightings. So something relating to how all this plays out and works together is, it's coming to a kind of fruition in the middle of our research. Yes, Miss
Timothy
Olivia.
guessing, how many members of MJ12 did JFK have contact with?
Well, they would submit reports. Remember, Forrestal was on the original group, and should I pull out the Jim Mars thing?
Yeah.
Let's do it. Look, Jim Mars and I used to share some fascinating conversations on and off the record. This is one of those things he told me, and I've got this. It's about a minute and a half, but this is Jim Mars, the late great Jim Mars, who gave us such a great knowledge base around all these topics, talking about Kennedy's knowledge of the Roswell incident as a congressman and how deep he was involved early on in the UFO file. About a minute and a half. Are you ready?
Mhm.
Let me get a good shot of Kennedy to go with this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep here in X Series special report, JFK COG UFO Campaign 2024. Here's a clip of the great Jim Mars talking about Kennedy's knowledge early on of the UFO file.
Back in the 40s, there was a government group called the Interplanetary Phenomenon Group, which when I first heard about that, I said, oh, that's just got to be some kind of joke, but it was very real. It's been documented. There are documents now found from this group. And in 1947, they actually produced a report on the Roswell crash. And it is pretty specific and pretty out there. They talked about two different landing zones, LZ1, LZ2. They talked about multiple bodies being found. They talked about the whole thing. They gave names, dates, places. They also were the first that I know that mentioned that before the crash in Roswell, there were all kinds of sightings around New Mexico. And in fact, they had been picking up unidentified objects on their radar. And it was becoming quite a concern to them through the first part of that week in July preceding the crash at Roswell. But in the back of this report, it said one of the few members of Congress to have knowledge of this is Representative John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. And it said he had served in he was in naval intelligence. He was an officer in naval intelligence, and that he apparently had a source of information within the office of the Secretary of the Air Force, or Secretary of the Air Force, I guess. At that time, it had been the Army Air Corps. Now, that's true. Most people only know Kennedy's background as being the commander of the PT-109, right, which he got sunk by a Japanese destroyer in the South Pacific. But it's true that prior to that, he had served in Washington with naval intelligence. So, see, that tells you that this is a legitimate report.
Wow. That's really incredible. There was a lot, and there's more in that too. But basically, what Jim was telling us was there was this group that was sort of following very early on UFO reports. And the Roswell incident was something that they tracked and sent a report back. And the only person in Congress that they knew somehow through some liaison had an interest in it was Jack Kennedy. And it's interesting because it is Forrestal, as a member of MJ12, who, is best friends with Kennedy, takes him also to Berlin after the war, just before he's a congressman, and walks him around all the ruins, etc. So he's somebody who could have been a really deep pipeline for JFK on the issue. And we see there that there's a record of JFK getting a Roswell UFO crash report in 1947 as a congressman. So think about how deep the knowledge history around the UFO file goes with Kennedy. Yes, the great Jim Mars, late great.
Thomas Marzak, where's the documentation located of that UFO study group that JFK was a part of? What book reproduces it?
UFO study group that he was a part of. Well, I mean, officially, none of that would ever be public. But there's a number of things. For example, there's all the outreach of Donald Menzel that Stanton Friedman found, and all of that was directly related to saying, I can help you with this, touchy subject. And in the meantime, his public persona was to be the biggest debunker of UFOs. So we had that whole dynamic going on in the government at the time. But the Kennedy links to the UFO file run deep, as do the links in the assassination around the UFO file. For example, Lee Harvey Oswald working for the person who created the X Files for the FBI and whose big job was to go out and study all the crashed UFO cases, Guy Bannister. So also, he was connected with this whole thing about Walter Dornberger, because that's pretty interesting piece, because Dornberger was one of the paperclip Nazis that they brought over here. And he was somebody who was going to be, sentenced to death at the judgment at Nuremberg. And the UK really wanted that. And it was von Braun who said, he's my boss in the rocket program. I need him. He saved him. And they brought him over here, and he became the vice president of Bell Helicopter. His protege that worked under him was Michael Payne, and that's where the Oswalds stayed, with Michael and Ruth Payne. So you've got the advanced technology piece all around whenever you crisscross around. And in the middle of the assassination, you have COG people. So you've got something, there's a weird thing that I've put on the record, because you have deep state people who can research the continuity of government piece, and you have people who can look at the UFO file. But if you really look at them together, then you find all these strange kind of, the crisscross of the secrecy and the operational aspect gives you some idea that the people who are plotting to create this kind of private, advanced government with the advanced technology, that they're the ones who are working the UFO file angle. So they have the control over these things. I find that interesting. The Dornberger case is something I've explored, and you just can't get around it. I mean, the other thing is that Oswald, when he was leaving New Orleans, going to Dallas, presumably to get a job stacking books for $1.25 an hour, he is telling everyone that I'm going to NASA and I've hit my pot of gold, at the end of the rainbow, I'm going to work for NASA. So that's what whoever was running him was telling him, hey, you're going to get this great job with NASA. So whenever you get around Kennedy, the push for the space program and his own acknowledgement of the thing. I have a letter of a person inside the Air Force writing back to Kennedy in 1958 as a senator saying, whoa, Senator, I'm not holding back any information. I don't know, what you're talking about, but the Air Force has given all the information on UFOs to you guys. So I don't have the letter sent by JFK. That's something I will get my hands on. But obviously, in 1958, JFK is pressuring Air Force officials for UFO information. Now, the response letter is on file in two places. It's at the JFK Library and also in the private papers of the person who sent the letter. And 2 or 3 episodes ago, I covered the guy. But I think it's important because we have to understand, look, UFOs are on the front page of the New York Times in 1960. With this whole flap that I just showed you, where Hillenkotter says, hey, they're keeping too much secrecy around it. And in the meantime, they're claiming these hoaxes. In fact, they're taking it seriously behind the scenes. That's 1960 when Kennedy is running for president. So the UFO thing is right there. The idea that they've kind of submerged the topic over the years, we have to reconnect with the time and see what was going on behind the scenes. Remember that Dr. Joseph Farrell found Project Blue Book being the political football inside the McCarthy hearings. And Roy Cohn is, pressing all these generals about the activities at Monmouth related to Project Blue Book. So Roy Cohn in 1952, 53, somewhere in there, is working, pressuring information on the UFO file. Later, he goes on to have all these interesting crisscrosses inside of those aerospace groups. And who does he end up? the mentor of politically for over a decade, even according to uh, the people involved, Trump. So, you have the setup for the aerospace UFO file secret technology connection is sitting there in plain sight. And so when we get people fighting about all these other issues in relation to this, and you say, oh, Trump's a racist or something, you know, it's part of the kind of public silencing of the thing that's going on in the background, which is those people are definitely dueling it out. And think of how far this administration is willing to go to prosecute a political enemy. They're still doing the bidding of this whole thing. They have a major news outlet proffering a deal, hoping that Trump will take it with this idea that somehow he'll be pardoned. And the whole idea of this document chase, I mean, what was the document chase really all about? Does that relate to the UFO file? Those are the questions to open up. Forget about Grush. That's just more of the CIA junket, and they have to be out there. They have to control the space. I mean, does it bother us that the CIA has taken over the UFO file debate a whole? I mean, does it bother all the researchers in the field that way? It's pretty damn disturbing. And, the only way to kind of make it stop is to expose it. And, you're never going to get any truth out of those guys. So unless you like living in lies, you're going to look for different type of truth in relation to the UFO file. And it's not easy to find, granted. And, when you get all these people out there like Nick Pope or whatever, and they're on Fox News, look, they're just relieved that they can talk, about the subject. And, they've been rolled out there in some capacity. And other researchers were so beaten down by the intelligence agencies for years that they didn't have the ability, they were deprived of the ability to develop a thriving field. So they see this as their ticket out. But what it is it's an invitation for them and the people who follow their work into the lion's mouth of the intelligence agencies and their emergency threat program. So this is the way, opening the discussion up, the ideas from the things we're talking about here. This is how you shake out of that hypnosis, the hypnosis of life and of the media and this false intelligence program. That's the amount of evidence that I've presented just on this show. Never mind other, there's been a lot of other people doing it, great work, but just on this show, you would get more than enough information to realize that you're in the middle of a PSYOP fraud rollout on the UFO thing. Yes.
I wanted to circle back to this. Dean Tant said DJ didn't answer the question of who would expose the UFO files, RFK Jr. or Trump.
I mean, I weighed out the pluses and minuses. What do I think has the higher percentage? Well, Bobby is a transparency candidate. There's no question about it. But I could see Trump rolling out the UFO file. I think that his knowledge base around the UFO file is part of the problem of Trump for these people. So I see them both as disclosure-oriented people. But there's a transparency thing with Bobby Kennedy that I think if he could get his hands on the program and dig into it, he would let it out to the American public. So, both of them, I think, are, if we could get an election with Trump as the Republican candidate and Bobby as the Democratic candidate, we'd be in such great shape, and it would smash the incredible, neocon CIA lock on this government that we are just, in the middle of the situation, and we cannot, through apathy or anything else. I see the apathy so much, and I want to point it out again. The idea that a presidential election doesn't matter, is kind of a slick thing to say, but in fact, they do matter. And especially now, this could be the most important election of our lifetimes. The Biden administration has got to go, and they will destroy America. They are a sick organization, and he's not even there. We don't even know who's running him. But if you take a look at some of the people around, you know, like Blinken and the others, they're all in on trying to get a nuclear war with Russia. I mean, they're insane. So between that and the destruction of any kind of, you know, social program, I mean, their whole thing, their whole idea of a social program is a drag show for kids. I mean, the destruction of the culture is in the White House. There's no question about it. So the removal of that regime, which is flouting all the democratic rules and you know, any kind of idea of the rule of law, has to be paramount in the minds of any American. So I don't think you can say this election, well, you know, let's make sure that we get the right councilman. I hear this kind of stuff all the time. Look, you have got to have the correct president. Bobby Kennedy would be a fantastic president for America, and he doesn't have to agree with every issue. He doesn't have to be the perfect, you know, candidate for some particular issue. But this is a guy who wants to drive the narrative forward, and he wants to, you know, bring sort of this idea that we can have a totally different country. And, you know, the narrative he wants to build is that people can get along. Well, the media, their whole thing is, no, we should all have civil war. You know, you should hate this person because they're not taking your particular social belief. It's absurd. You know, Americans have always been able to work things out one way or another. And a lot of that is just live and let live. We learned that a long time ago. So, you know, what is this all about, really? And is a war being staged for us? And are we walking right into that trap? They would use the UFO thing in a heartbeat. There's no question about it. So, you know, if the question becomes, do I think Bobby Kennedy would make a great president? Yeah. And I think he would open up the UFO file. But I think that Trump, there's a lot to say in relation to Trump on this, that I think that Trump would be an incredible antidote to the things that have gone on in the Biden administration. Either way, we have to smash the Biden regime and create a new political paradigm. Yes.
Yeah, I think their reasons, their intentions for disclosure would be very different.
Right. Trump might be revenge at this
yeah,
point.
exactly. I do want to share this exchange. So Jocelyn Buckner said, I saw John Alexander at MUFON. He said disclosure in another month. I said, that man is dark. And Jocelyn continues, you got that right. When I asked him what he'd do if Trump won again, he said, I'd fall on my sword. I asked, what about RFK Jr.? He said, what about him? He won't be running.
Oh, well, John Alexander is pretty creepy, but that's kind of like, you know, his reputation or whatever. He is somebody who is aware of the use of occult practices in relation to the UFO thing. And so there's always been something kind of fundamentally creepy about him. But, you know, also, I think he likes to make that kind of dramatic impression on somebody. You know, for sure, RFK is running. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you know, a lot of the Alexander stuff is like The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is sort of a weird knockoff of the type of things that Alexander did. But what's interesting about guys like that is their study of, you know, zombies and things of this nature. I mean, this is pretty, when somebody says that he's dark or whatever, you know, he's by nature in that intelligence world. They love people like that.
Okay, Chris Lothian, that out of 144 UFO sightings, 143 were unexplained but assumed to be extraterrestrial origin. The other was identified as a collapsed balloon. Are they trying to build up a Chinese UFO threat? Frankie Torres says, if war was to break out with China, does DJ think or believe that the U.S.-operated back-engineered UFOs will expose themselves to protect the USA?
Well, I think that there's a weird thing inside the government cooperating with the Chinese government. And so I think if they were doing anything real along a war line, that they'd be doing it in tandem, and they're both in both of their interests. I do think that China's played their cards very well, and in America, we've been over militarized, and we haven't paid much attention to it. But when we got, like, let's go back to 9/11 for a moment. When we got the continuity of government program, when we got 9/11, when we got the emergency that we live under 9/11, we got things like the Patriot Act, we got things like the TSA, and Homeland Security with its 250,000, yes, 250,000 employees. Now, that's a gigantic infrastructure. It's practically an invasion. We also got Northcom, which would take over. That's the whole COG takeover there with Northcom. Northcom wasn't there before 9/11. And every president, as I've mentioned, signs off on this order, about the 9/11 emergency. We're still under it. So I'm actually going to read a quote from Professor Scott about that. But my point on this, I think, which maybe is a larger point, is that, we've been living under this, and they've moved it a little bit at a time. It didn't matter if they were Democrats or Republicans. Bush moved it. He became, the king fascist after 9/11. And Obama, somebody was saying to me, there was an article about RFK, and they were like, oh, his voice becomes a major challenge for the election. Look, this is one of the most articulate people and one of the best thinkers out there. And I think any of the challenges that he has with his voice and the aphonia is something that makes him, very human and relatable. And, it didn't matter. You had somebody like Obama who knew how to read his teleprompter very well, but he was bombing 8 countries when he left. So much for a peace candidate, right? I mean, come on. Let's go to the core on these things and kind of remove the superficial facades and just get to it. Now, what is interesting when we look at this move of totalitarianism, 9/11 gave them the Patriot Act, but it gave them COG. They actually were able to exercise continuity of government program. So that's the paradigm that we're in, because the thing that we're up against since the 1960s is this continuity of government out of control aspect. And, so what's known as the deep state, the major threads inside of the continuity of government program come directly out of this. So the more that we know about this, the more we expose about this, we're in much better shape, I think. Let me see here. Let me see if I have this quote. Couple of interesting things. Yes. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter carried out the largest number of revisions to the presidential directives since Eisenhower, carefully rewriting each of the COG emergency documents, aware of the changes in the Cold War in the country since Ike's time and the recent massive unlawfulness on the part of secret services. Not coincidentally, each of them faced divisions among their supporters, and they became the first and second incumbent presidents to be defeated for re-election since Herbert Hoover in 1932. Those presidents, even on their level, they were insiders. They started tinkering around with COG and defanging it, and they were like, oh no, out they go. When Reagan gets in, Bush, there's a whole story there about this, and that's Bush with Ford. But Bush was forced on the Reagan ticket, and Reagan was forced to take him. Reagan had 2 other choices for VP, but there was this whole thing inside there, including David Rockefeller, that was saying, if you don't take on George Bush, then forget it, and all the support will drop away. So he was forced to have this. Bush will become a major insider for the COG people, and he'll exercise it in all the fraud that goes on in the Iran-Contra program. What's interesting about that is he will become, as a out-of-office president, someone who is part of the civilian leadership of the continuity of government program. Somebody on the civilian leadership side and continuity of government now is Liz Cheney, who is the daughter of Dick Cheney. She's the one who gives Trump all this big hard time, like, I'll run against him and all that stuff. That's the COG people registering. They don't want Trump in there. And that's a very interesting thing to watch, because the Trump piece, whatever it is, they're afraid of him as the bull in the china shop, upending a lot of the things that they've put in place in this secret program. So when you see that, it's very interesting that George Bush was part of the liaison committee for COG. And when you look for other people, it becomes interesting. So we're starting to look at it and say, wait a minute, are these people on some level, preparing themselves to inherit the new earth? Let's just go with this for a minute. So they figure, humanity will destroy itself, or we'll, help them do that, or there's a pole shift coming, or whatever it is, and that these COG bunkers, this underground world that they've created, is somehow going to be, that they are the inheritors and they're the Darwinian survivors. And that's where you get all the weird WEF rhetoric and all the rest. This, to me, if you tie these threads together, it makes a lot of sense. It really, you start to see the arrogance that's involved. But on a government, just on a straight up government media level, the level of secrecy inside the continuity of government should never have been allowed, one. And that's the thing that should be rolled back and rescinded. And the sooner the better. Yes, Miss Olivia, we'll take 2 more questions.
Okay, so these are all together. Charles Milligan, I thought we had been under the COG since 2020 when they locked in at Cheyenne Mountain. I figure DJ will get to the bottom of it. Till then, my understanding is we're already there. Let's start there.
Well, technically, no. Because technically, if you're under COG, you're going to know. What's interesting is that I've explained a lot of the weird things that happened at the end of the Trump administration, but this much I'll just put on the record in a short flash way. Trump looked at the possibility, since he knew that they try to take him out and replace him with COG rules. That was one of the things that they were going to do that October before the election. So as soon as the election was over, he fired the defense secretary, which is an extraordinarily strange thing to do. But he realized that Esper had taken part in this because Esper had elected and replaced our friend O'Shaughnessy, who was the COG commander, with this other COG commander, General Van Herk. So he, as a weird part of the exit of his presidency, he started to rewrite a lot of rules relating to emergency powers. So some people took that as saying, well, Trump activated continuity of government and is still president. No, but he put something in there which basically puts him on the record, I would say. And so it is unusual. And I understand where people got a false impression about COG. One of the things I want to point out is COG you never used to be able to even talk about. This is the extraordinary thing. And if you go back to a period like 1987, it gets raised in the Iran-Contra hearings. Oliver North says it, and everyone jumps on him and says, you can't talk about that. What are you doing? So they kept it as a really heavy secret. Later, you had people like Nancy Pelosi coming out during the Trump administration, during COVID, being like, I'm the third in line for the presidency. I just talked to the continuity of government people, So they were rolling it out. Newsweek was talking about it. Newsweek banned me on Twitter because I exposed the people that they were saying had set up these things, the generals who were ready to seize power if Trump, did anything to not leave the presidency. So it was this whole weird thing. And they said the source was someone who was in charge of continuity of government who's now retired. And I said, well, it's O'Shaughnessy. You already said it was a man, and the person before O'Shaughnessy was a woman, and the guy before that isn't alive. So it has to be O'Shaughnessy. And so
deductive reasoning.
Yeah. So they screwed up and they let out that it was O'Shaughnessy. And then they were like, how dare you, and all that. And the guy is a big writer. As a matter of fact, he's cited in some of the Peter Dale Scott's work. And I asked Professor Scott about him, and he said, well, he's great, except he'll never take his COG research anywhere. He'll never talk about Cheney and all that, but he will talk very informatively about the structure. And I think the guy's name is William Arkin or whatever, but he got into like kindergarten level, and he was calling me he called me Captain Kangaroo. And he was like, well, you so we know he had a nerve there. But this is interesting because here are these people at Newsweek and this guy who studied this secret program cheering on generals who were supposed to be planning against the president. I mean, it's really, this whole thing has gotten very strange the way that it's rolled out. But if we didn't know about COG before, we for sure do now. Quick thing on this with COG and Professor Scott. It comes from America Deep State. It's Doomsday Project and Deep Events. Just a quick little blip here. It is clear that the Office of Emergency Preparedness, OEP, known from 61 to 68 as the Office of Emergency Planning and from 1992 to 94 as the National Program Office, or Project 908, supplied a common denominator for key personnel in virtually all of the structural events I've discussed. This is a long way from establishing that the OEP itself was involved in generating the deep events, but I believe that the alternative communications network housed in OEP and part of Project 908 played a significant role in the three major ones: JFK assassination, Iran-Contra, and 9/11. This is easiest to show in the case of 9/11, where it is conceded that the continuity of government plans for the Doomsday Project were implemented by Cheney on 9/11. Apparently before the last of the four hijacked planes had crashed. The 9/11 Commission could not locate records of the key decisions taken by Cheney on that day, suggesting that they may have been taken place on a secure phone in the tunnel leading to the presidential bunker, with such a high classification that the 9/11 Commission was never supplied with phone records. My guess is this was a COG network phone. It's almost certain that the secure phone in the White House tunnel belonged to the Secret Service and therefore was part of the secure network of the White House Communications Agency. If so, it represents a striking link between 9/11 and the JFK assassination. The White House Communications Agency boasts on its website that the agency was a key player in documenting the assassination of President Kennedy. However, it's not clear for whom this documentation was conducted, for the WHCA logs and transcripts were in fact withheld inexcusably from the Warren Commission and later from the House Committee on Assassinations. The Secret Service had installed a WHCA portable radio in the lead car of the presidential motorcade. This in turn was in contact by police radio with the pilot car ahead of it, carrying Dallas Police Department Deputy Chief Lumpkin of the 488th Army Intelligence Reserve Unit. Records of the WHCA communications from the motorcade never reached the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassination, or the Assassination Records Review Board. Let me break that down for you. Basically, the continuity of government communications network was involved deeply in the JFK assassination and was also used by Cheney during the 9/11 event. What's interesting is in neither case do we have records of any of it. In neither commission, the 9/11 Commission, nor any of the Kennedy assassination commissions, never had any record of who was doing the recording, what they in fact recorded, or what they were doing being activated in the case of the Kennedy assassination. So there's a lot of weirdness about that communications network. And, that opens up a lot of questions, but that's a key piece to keep in mind when it comes to the continuity of government program. They could plan to overthrow the United States using the entire communication system that they have, and we would never have any paper trail of anything because that group is completely unaccountable to the government. There's no oversight of the continuity of government people. So General Van Herk hanging out there, leading NORAD and talking about UFO shootdowns and stuff is a very serious thing, in fact, when you get into the idea of a UFO threat, because these people literally are operating with their own rules inside of their own government underground structure. So that for me is sort of the key. When you talk about deep state, that's deep. Underground deep. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the JFK COG UFO Campaign 2024 Government Secrets Revealed. There was more about Bobby Kennedy I wanted to get into, but I'm going to get into more about him and his candidacy going forward. With this, we'll take one last question, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so these are together.
Okay.
W.C. Ray, who does the COG answer to? Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, most of these politicians are Masons and subgroups as well. And N. Owl says, how do we know off-planet entities aren't calling the shots?
Well, there's a lot of there are a lot of stories about alien interaction and us working with aliens on certain types of programs. So there's enough stories with it that I think it should be thought of as a potential option, and it should be explored in that fashion. There's kind of too many stories involving something of that nature, so I think that we should be open to it. In terms of who does COG report to, that's the nature of the problem, which is it's so super secret that it seems like nobody actually knows. You would think they would report to the CIA and the president and to the Joint Chiefs, but it's not very clear. We know that when Van Herk was giving his reports about NORAD, he was talking about the homeland this and the homeland that. Well, I mean, what are you talking about exactly? Do you mean the United States? So I remember a conversation I had with Nick Bagich about this, and he was, he's had family who were deep involved in the government, senators. He said that the way that these national security briefings work is you go into one of these rooms and you're not allowed to take any notes, and you're basically treated like a 6-year-old. These people know all the stuff. There's no way to cross-reference, cross-check them, and you can't record any of their responses. And then they hustle you out of the room. So it's kind of like the oversight is basically for show. The way that we can get an eye on this is when they're trying to promote this threat thing, we can start asking questions about, well, what would an emergency response be to a UFO threat, and get them to talk in open congressional hearings about COG. See, that would be useful. That's where I think guys like Burchett could really bring something forward, because if he just sits there and, sits there with his mouth open, taking in stories from Grush about, we recovered alien pilots, it's going to be the biggest waste of congressional time. And supposedly, and I'm very skeptical of congressional people and people in the Senate and all the rest, and their sudden interest in UFOs. I've been pointing this out for a little bit, and I've pointed out the individuals involved, Rubio, Gillibrand, and all that, and how they've attached and interfered with government processes to get this UFO Defense Office as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. I think there are big problems with this. And so when I see people, I want to know, how did you first hear about UFOs? What is your interest in it? Ruben Galejo, in Arizona, who's running for Senate now as congressman. He's like, we need that UAP truth. Where did you first hear about UFOs? Are you interested in the subject? Did you watch movies that made you interested in it? I can tell you exactly all the things that happened to me that got me interested in the subject. I read John Keel books when I was like 9 years old. So, where do these people get this incredible interest? My own take on it is that they've been hearing things going on in the background. They know there's a gravy train of the breakaway technology people breaking back into society, and that there's going to be a big gold rush around this stuff, but they're going to relate it to a UFO threat piece. I want to hear what they're hearing, and that's the way I think that we should look at the thing. So Burchett is on that level. Now, Burchett, if he's honest about this, and he could be, then he owes it to everyone to take this thing to a different level and to start to get people on the record about, well, is there a group protecting the UFO stuff that, is destroying reputations, and were they involved in an earlier assassination of the president because he was trying to get at that? These are the things, and opening up the COG question, this could be gigantic if he did it right, but if it just is a CIA dog and pony show, then it's going to be a complete waste of time with tons of headlines and, Grush making those faces and them saying like whistleblower, well, I can already write the script for that. So I think there is a way to do it totally differently. And a guy like Burchett is independent enough maybe to do it. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question.
I thought that was the last question.
Oh, good. Okay. Actually, it's a good note to end on. How about super chatters?
Okay. I have a bunch. Gillenjoy R, Bobo the Clown, Global Atlantis, Peter Rabbit, Eurythmia's Fun, John Folden, Jay Parsons, Weekend at Bernie's, Just a Girl, Steve Vaughn, the Philip K. Dick Film Festival, Jonathan McIntosh, Heidi James, Ms., Doreen Hewitt, Neurosurgery Highland, Jocelyn Buckner, Nancy Carter, Terry Doherty, Erica Swenson-Elliott, The Wheat in Your Garden, Michael Snow, Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, W.C. Ray, Amarillo Gunrunners, Stefan Vanderlaan, Robert Scott, Kristen Kay, Hasha, Maggie Smith, Jam and Mammy, and Jack Smack. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Incredible. Jack Smack, I have his super chat up here. It says, thank you for the information. Please don't stop. Every episode you've put out and I've watched has either verified my knowledge or increased my awareness and led me to more. Thank you very much. I've been inside the pyramid Caffrey and have traveled the world. Fascinating. Wow. Thank you so much for your support. And that sounds like a fascinating journey indeed. There's a whole thing about Alvarez and the pyramids. One last thing I'll mention about Alvarez, since we're talking about pyramids, is he makes this quote about, I was thinking about this thing about the pyramids, and I decided I would go for a little vacation down to Antarctica. And then it hit me when I was in Antarctica that there's a secret room in the pyramids. I was like, what is going on with this guy? So isn't that, that's
fascinating.
One of those. I'll do a couple of shout outs here. We've got Sammy, Elijah Muhammad, Traveling Riverside, Blues Sky. I like there's kind of a blues vibe out there tonight. Where's Muddy Waters? There's Michael Watson. I guess that's pretty close.
Can I throw
that's
you
all,
just
folks.
Sort of a
yes.
Of a generic
Najat Madri? Yes, go for it.
Okay. Esoteric 369, DJ, from a spiritual perspective, do you have hope for the human family?
Of course. Oh, yeah.
And why?
Yeah.
What gives you hope?
Well, we do so many shows dealing with the mystery schools and the challenges that they bring forward. But there's a, inside of the challenges, there's a great opportunity for knowledge and development. And, we've been given a great gift in that sense. We're just kind of working through very difficult political process. And this is the point at which humanity has to face down its shadow in that sense. But there's no question in my mind that humanity is moving into a good place. We just need the courage, I would say, to speak frankly, no matter what the cost. And I'm putting a lot on free speech right now, free, thoughtful speech, that I think it is the actual solution to the difficulties humanity finds itself into, which is, we've kind of arrived at a point where they're trying to silence the voices of truth, and that gets into a deep, deep spiritual war. And, if you go into the work of Steiner, if you go into the work of Casey, you see that they're giving you the tools for that challenge, that battle. And so we can't complain about the tools, but there's that whole thing about attunement. And I think the attunement makes all the difference. Millhouse 900. My interest in UFOs was piqued years ago by a tiny craft that followed me up Highway 101. Appreciate your insight, knowledge, and also your audience. Wow. Where is Highway 101? I'm afraid I don't know where that is. Is that in the South? Let us know. But it's getting followed is always tricky. I remember interviewing a couple that were abducted and they were abducted out of their car while driving. So not even pull over the car, just you're coming, you're coming in with us. So, that gets hardcore. Hal Colombo, Oswald was a hero. I have a picture of Oswald here. That's Oswald at 15 in the Civil Air Patrol, and he will be plucked out for his very unusual qualities. And David Ferry will spot him for intelligence work, and so many unusual things will happen to Oswald. He will be sent to the Soviet Union. He will come back with a wife who is the niece of a GRU colonel. And it's an incredible journey in the way that they used him, being recruited right out of the Civil Air Patrol. And he is, so much a part of this story. And it is interesting. And I think in the final analysis, what they were doing with Oswald is they were convincing him, hey, you're going to have a chance to be involved in this major operation. I think they were telling him that they were sussing out an assassination plot, and he thought that he was penetrating it. And so, Jim Garrison was fond of saying one of the biggest injustices was that Oswald was working for the government and they turned him into the patsy. That's the kind of sick thing that, that whole counterintelligence thing. It's like, oh, it's a brilliant stroke by George Joannides, the ultimate psychological warfare project, but when you get right down to it, it's just, it's a sick thing to do. And so if Joannides was a genius, yes, I'm sure he was, but he was a genius at doing dysfunctional things. I took HW 101 from Arizona. That's Chrissy. That's interesting. That's my guess. Arizona. What do you think?
No. It's everybody says that's California. It's the Pacific Coast.
Oh, that's what it is. Okay. So we got our answers there. Fantastic. So great to be with you. Ideas from excellent out there tonight. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. And happy camper. Oswald was a sacrifice. Boy, that's really true. Whew. Going deep on that. You've really made me a mystery school student. I totally jive with the Bible. Thank you. Jimmy Lyle Kennemer. Yes. There's so much mystery in the Bible. Forget it. It's off the charts. Amazing. Oh, there's the other part of that, Chrissy. Thank you. California to Oregon for my 21st birthday. Wow. So that's what it is. Fantastic. Well, now we know.
I do want to. Kontiki Man said, any chance of circling back to Truman, Hillenkotter, Missouri, and Cape Girardeau 41?
I wouldn't worry about it. They're coming up.
Okay.
They're coming up. And Hillenkotter is important because he was ex-share, and that's crucial in all of this. Everyone, we will see you all next week. Exciting interviews coming up for you. X-series episodes, documentaries, events. Make sure you're on that mailing list for the newsletter by going to darkjournalist.com. It's a free newsletter, especially if you're new. Make sure you're on there, and we will see you all next week. We might, with all the things that are breaking, we might have a special report for you midweek if these things are coming up. And, hopefully there'll be some great sort of feedback on Bobby Kennedy's foreign policy speech that he's giving on June 20th. And all of the machinations around the prosecution of President Trump. Very interesting on the political scene right now. But I consider that a gigantic injustice and basically locking up your political opponent. It's very dangerous fascist activity. So we're going to call a lot of attention to it. And I want to say this in relation to the UFO file. Thank you, Eurythmy. Much appreciated. And the COG piece, it's crucial. It's a crucial piece, and some aspects of like the UFO thing, you can take it or leave it, or you can have fun with it. But the thing that they're trying to move out there and capture the narrative with, and capture the debate with, and drive all this attention around the intelligence agency's UFO threat program, that in combination with COG is a very dangerous thing. And so bringing it to the fore in a political atmosphere is crucial. And that's something that I hope we see more of. And we're certainly doing it on this program. So thank you so much for helping us do it. And to all our subscribers, we couldn't get by without you. And I want to say that we appreciate it. We'll see you all next week. And it says end broadcast up there, but it never really ends.
Never really ends. I don't want to go.
Isn't that nice?
I want to stay with everybody.
Well, see, now you've made a friend of Olivia. Olivia, bravo. Fantastic questions and much obliged. And, Olivia just doing a great job
Thank you.
with all of it. Thank you so much, everyone. And see you all next week. And never let it be forgot.
Once there was a Camelot.
And there could be again. Don't forget.
God bless.